They said a deaf woman had no place at the altar, that silence was a curse, not a language. But when Thomas Grady spat his vows like poison and the church erupted in mockery, one man's voice tore through the cruelty like thunder. "She's better than all of you." What happened next in that Montana chapel would shake a town to its core and rewrite what it meant to truly hear another human soul. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Elena's story travels across this world. The morning of June 14th, 1879, broke over Deerhorn Crossing with the kind of crystalline light that made liars of honest men and cowards of the brave. Montana territory stretched endless and indifferent beyond the town's weathered buildings, sage and sweetgrass bending in wind that carried promises it never intended to keep. In the cramped room above Murphy's General Store, Elena Wells stood before a mirror whose silver had begun to fail, studying a stranger in white lace who looked back with eyes too old for 22 years. Her wedding dress, if it could be called that, had belonged to her mother, then her grandmother. The fabric yellowed at the seams where time had pressed its patient fingers. She'd spent 3 nights restitching the bodice by candlelight, her needle moving with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned long ago that perfection was the tax the world demanded of the different. The silence that filled her world held no comfort this morning. It pressed against her chest like a physical weight, heavy with the knowledge of what awaited her in that church. "You ready, girl?" Her Aunt Martha's lips formed the words, hands gesturing the question Elena had seen 1,000 times. The older woman's face carried that particular expression Elena had learned to read before she'd learned to read anything else. Pity wearing the mask of concern, duty dressed as love. Elena nodded because there was nothing else to do. She'd been ready the moment Thomas Grady made his proposal 3 months prior, not in the conventional sense, but ready in the way soldiers were ready for battles they knew they'd lose. He hadn't looked at her when he'd asked, his eyes fixed somewhere past her left shoulder, as though addressing someone more substantial than the deaf girl whose father's debt he was erasing with the transaction of marriage. "You're sure about this?" Martha's hands moved again, slower this time, as if reluctance could travel through the speed of signing. Elena picked up the small bouquet she'd gathered herself that morning. Wild roses and sage, purple lupine and white yarrow. She'd walked 2 miles before dawn to find them, because Thomas hadn't offered to buy flowers and her aunt's household budget stretched thin as winter ice. The thorns had pricked her fingers, tiny wounds she'd welcomed because at least pain was honest. "I'm sure," she signed back, the movement sharp and final. But she wasn't sure. How could anyone be sure when walking toward a future that felt less like marriage and more like erasure? Still, the alternative was worse. Her father's ranch had been crumbling for years, each season stripping away another piece of the life they'd built. When Jacob Wells had died suddenly last winter, Hart stopped mid-stride while feeding cattle, dropping into snow that buried him like a premature grave. He'd left behind debts that towered higher than good intentions. Thomas Grady owned those debts now. He'd bought them from the bank in Silver Bend, purchased her father's failures like someone buying livestock. And in the arithmetic of frontier justice, Elena was part of the settlement. Thomas needed a wife to manage his household, someone biddable and quiet who wouldn't question how he spent his money or where he spent his nights. A deaf woman suited his purposes perfectly, couldn't argue with what she couldn't hear, couldn't gossip about what she couldn't speak. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. Her silence, which the world had always counted as a deficit, had finally become currency, just not the kind anyone would wish for. "Time to go," Martha signed, her movements gentle despite the message's weight. They descended the narrow stairs, each step creaking underfoot, sounds Elena couldn't hear but could feel through the vibration in the wood, through the familiar rhythm of descent she'd learned by heart. The store below sat empty, Marcus Murphy having closed early to attend the wedding. Everyone in Deerhorn Crossing would be there, not to celebrate, Elena knew, but to witness. There was a difference. The morning air hit her face like cold water when they stepped outside, clean and sharp, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains that ringed the valley like ancient sentries. Elena paused, letting it fill her lungs, trying to draw strength from something larger than herself. A few early risers moved along the boardwalk, their glances sliding toward her then away, that familiar dance of acknowledgement and avoidance she'd known her entire life. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house made the sign of the cross as Elena passed. Charity Simmons, the schoolteacher, offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Old Ben Crawford just shook his head, his expression suggesting he was watching someone walk toward their execution. Maybe he was right. The church sat at the far end of Main Street, white clapboard and a steeple that reached toward heaven with more hope than conviction. Someone had decorated the entrance with ribbon, pale yellow, like the color of cowardice, Elena thought, then immediately regretted the bitterness. This was her wedding day. She should be thinking better thoughts, feeling better things, but honesty had always been her companion in silence, and honesty said this was wrong. The church doors stood open, a mouth ready to swallow her whole. Elena could see them inside, the turned heads, the sea of faces that represented every family in Deerhorn Crossing and half the families from the surrounding ranches. They packed the pews shoulder to shoulder, dressed in their Sunday best even though it was Thursday. This was entertainment, after all. The wedding of Thomas Grady, a man of property and position, to the deaf daughter of a failed rancher. People would talk about this for years. She stood at the threshold, her hand tight around the bouquet, thorns pressing through the thin fabric of her gloves. For one perfect, crystalline moment, Elena considered turning around, just walking away. Let Thomas keep the debts, keep the ranch, keep everything. She could head to Billings, maybe find work as a seamstress. She was skilled with her hands, patient, detail-oriented. There were worse fates than starting over. But then she thought of her father's grave, unmarked except for a wooden cross she'd carved herself. Thought of the ranch where she'd been born, where her mother had taught her to sign before fever took her when Elena was 7. Thought of how her father had fought, Lord, how he'd fought, to keep that land, to build something that would outlast him. And here she was, the last Wells, carrying the weight of all those dreams into a church where no one wanted her. Martha touched her arm, pointed to the interior. The Reverend Samuel Brooks stood at the altar in black wool that made him look like an undertaker. He probably felt like one, too. Elena forced her feet to move. One step, then another. The white runner beneath her boots stretched like an accusation. She crossed the threshold, and the crowd's attention swiveled toward her with an almost audible snap. She couldn't hear their gasps, their whispers, their cruel commentary, but she could see it. In the widened eyes, the covered mouths, the elbows digging into ribs as neighbors leaned close to share observations that felt like knives. She'd learned to read lips out of necessity, a skill developed over years of watching mouths form words she'd never hear. It was imperfect. Some words looked identical, context was everything, and fast talkers or mumblers might as well have been speaking foreign languages. But she'd become proficient enough to catch fragments, pieces of sentences that assembled themselves into a mosaic of cruelty. Can't believe he's actually, poor thing doesn't even. Charity case, if I ever. What kind of marriage? Old Mrs. Whitmore, the banker's wife, wasn't even trying to hide her disapproval. Her lips formed words sharp and clear. This is a mockery of the sacrament. Elena's steps faltered, just for a moment, just long enough for doubt to sink its claws deeper. But she kept walking because stopping meant drowning, and she'd been swimming against currents her whole life. This was just one more. Thomas waited at the altar, his tall frame rigid in a new suit that probably cost more than Elena's entire wardrobe. He was handsome in the way that mountains were handsome, imposing, cold, carved from something harder than flesh. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, his mustache trimmed with military precision. Everything about him spoke of control, of a man who'd measured his life into neat columns and didn't appreciate variables. When their eyes met, there was no warmth there, no affection, no anticipation, nothing remotely resembling love, just assessment. He was looking at her the way a man might look at a horse he'd purchased sight unseen, checking for defects, calculating whether he'd gotten his money's worth. Elena took her place beside him. He didn't offer his hand, didn't smile. Just turned to face the Reverend, his jaw tight, his whole body radiating the energy of a man enduring an unpleasant necessity. Reverend Brooks cleared his throat. She saw his Adam's apple bob, saw him grip his worn Bible like it might anchor him against the strangeness of this ceremony. His lips began to move in the familiar patterns of the wedding service. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." But Elena wasn't watching him. She was watching the crowd, reading the judgment written on every face. She saw Mabel Crawford, who'd been her closest friend in childhood, until Mabel's mother decided that association with that deaf girl reflected poorly on the family. Saw John Pritchard, who'd kissed her once behind the schoolhouse when they were 15, then pretended it never happened when his friends found out. Saw the collective face of a town that had tolerated her existence but never welcomed it, accepted her presence but never her personhood. The Reverend was speaking to Thomas now. She could tell by the direction of his gaze. "Do you, Thomas Edmund Grady, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Thomas's response was immediate, mechanical. "I do." No hesitation, no emotion, just words fulfilling a contract. Then the Reverend turned to her, his expression carrying that particular brand of pastoral sympathy that always made Elena feel more pitied than pastored. His lips began forming her vows. "Do you, Elena Marie Wells?" But Thomas interrupted. She saw him turn, saw his mouth open, saw the words form with crystalline clarity. "Stop!" The Reverend froze. The church, already quiet, seemed to achieve a deeper silence, the kind that preceded disaster. Elena's breath caught in her throat. This was it. He was calling it off. Whatever calculation had led him to this moment had been revised, the equation solved differently. Relief and humiliation warred in her chest, twin feelings she couldn't separate. Thomas turned to face the congregation, his voice, which Elena couldn't hear but could read, cutting through the space like judgment. "I can't do this." The words hung there, suspended in time. Elena felt the thorns of her bouquet pressing harder against her palm, drawing blood through her gloves. The world had narrowed to this moment, this public rejection, this final proof that she'd been right to never hope for anything more than survival. But Thomas wasn't finished. His lips kept moving. "I can't marry a woman who doesn't even hear her own name being spoken." Laughter erupted. Elena didn't need to hear it to know it was happening. She saw the mouths opening wide, saw shoulders shaking, saw heads thrown back in the universal posture of mirth. They were laughing. At her. At this moment. At the deaf girl who'd been foolish enough to believe she might deserve something as ordinary as a wedding. The humiliation was complete. Total. It pressed down on her with crushing weight, driving the air from her lungs. Elena's knees buckled. She felt them give way, felt herself starting to fall. The bouquet slipped from her hands, wild roses scattering across the white runner like drops of blood. She was going down, falling in front of everyone, the final indignity in a lifetime of small deaths. Then, arms caught her, strong arms steadying her before she could hit the ground. The world lurched, righted itself. Elena looked up, expecting her aunt, expecting someone taking pity. Instead, she found herself staring into eyes the color of storm clouds over the mountains, gray and serious and completely without pity. They belonged to a man she'd never seen before, a stranger in dusty range clothes and worn boots, his hands rough but gentle where they gripped her arms. He had the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors, his face lined by sun and wind, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that suggested he'd forgotten to comb it that morning. He helped her straighten, made sure she had her footing, then released her with a nod that conveyed more respect than she'd received in the entire ceremony. Then he turned toward the congregation, toward Thomas, toward the Reverend, his whole body shifting into something that reminded Elena of how mountains blocked storms. His mouth opened, and though Elena couldn't hear the words, she could read them perfectly because they were spoken with the kind of clarity born from absolute certainty. "That's enough." The laughter died. She saw it happen, saw mouths close mid-guffaw, saw smiles freeze and crack. The stranger's presence commanded something the Reverend's prayers never had: attention. Absolute undivided attention. He strode toward the altar with the confidence of a man who'd never learned to doubt his right to exist in any space. When he reached Thomas, he didn't hesitate, just spoke words Elena read with crystal clarity. "You're a coward and a fool." Thomas's face went red, then white. Who the hell? But the stranger had already turned away from him, dismissing him as thoroughly as one might dismiss a poorly trained dog. He faced the congregation instead, and his voice, Elena could tell from the way people leaned back, the way they seemed to physically react, filled the space with authority. "She's better than all of you." The words landed like physical blows. Elena saw people flinch, saw Mrs. Whitmore's hand fly to her chest as if personally struck. The stranger wasn't finished. He pointed at Thomas, at the Reverend, at the crowd, his finger moving like an accusation finding its marks. "This woman has more courage in her silence than any of you have in all your talking. She walked in here with her head high, knowing full well what you thought of her, and she was willing to bind herself to a man who doesn't deserve to breathe the same air she does." Not out of love. He shot Thomas a look of pure contempt, but because she values honor and obligation over her own comfort. That's called character, something none of you would recognize if it introduced itself personally. Elena stood frozen, watching this stranger defend her with a ferocity that felt surreal. No one had ever fought for her. Not like this. Not with words that cut deeper than silence ever could. The stranger turned to her then, and the hardness in his expression softened into something she couldn't quite name. He spoke directly to her, his lips forming words carefully, making sure she could read them. "You deserve better than this." Then he looked at the Reverend. "I'll marry her." The words detonated through the space. Elena saw the Reverend's eyes widen to the size of silver dollars, saw Thomas's face twist with rage and confusion, saw the entire congregation collectively lose their ability to process what was happening. "What?" The Reverend's voice must have risen because his face turned red with effort. "You can't just—" "Why not?" The stranger's reply was calm, measured. "You were about to perform a marriage ceremony. I'm volunteering to be the groom. She came here to get married. I'm offering marriage. The only difference is I'm not doing it to settle a debt or to get cheap household labor. I'm doing it because every person deserves to be treated with dignity, and she hasn't gotten a drop of it in this room." He turned back to Elena, and she saw the question form on his lips. "If you'll have me." The church had achieved the kind of silence that preceded explosions. Every eye was fixed on Elena, waiting to see what the deaf girl would do when offered an escape hatch by a complete stranger. It was madness, absolute madness. She didn't know this man's name, his profession, anything about him except that he'd caught her when she fell, and he'd called a room full of people cruel when they deserved it. But she'd come here to marry a stranger anyway. At least this stranger had kind eyes. Elena's hands moved before her mind fully processed the decision. She signed 3 words, clear and deliberate. "Yes. Thank you." The stranger smiled, not a big smile, just a slight curve of his mouth that somehow conveyed more warmth than she'd felt in months. "I'm Colt Brenner," he said, speaking slowly so she could read his lips. "I run a ranch about 15 miles north of here. It's not much, but it's honest work on honest land. And I give you my word. I won't hurt you, I won't use you, and I won't let anyone else do either." The simplicity of the promise undid something in Elena's chest. She nodded because words, signed or otherwise, felt inadequate. Colt turned to the Reverend. "So, are you going to perform this ceremony or not?" Reverend Brooks looked like a man who'd accidentally stumbled into someone else's fever dream. He glanced at Thomas, who stood frozen in rage and disbelief. He looked at the congregation, seeking guidance from faces that offered none. Finally, he looked at Elena, and whatever he saw there must have been enough because he sighed heavily and opened his Bible again. "This is highly irregular," he muttered. "Most decent things are," Colt replied. Thomas finally found his voice. "You can't do this. I own her father's debts. This is a legally binding—" "You own debts on land and property," Colt interrupted, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "You don't own a human being, and if you finish that sentence implying otherwise, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation outside this church." Thomas's mouth snapped shut. For all his bluster, he apparently recognized the look of a man who'd back up his words with action. He glared at Elena as if this were somehow her fault, then spun on his heel and stalked toward the door, his footsteps, which Elena couldn't hear, apparently echoing like thunder based on how people flinched. "Anyone else have objections?" Colt asked the room at large. "Because now's the time." No one spoke. The congregation sat like statues, too shocked to react, too bewildered to protest. "Good." Colt turned to Elena, offered his hand. "Shall we?" Elena took it. His palm was calloused, warm, steady. She stood beside him, the stranger who'd become her unexpected savior, and faced the Reverend who looked like he'd aged 10 years in as many minutes. "Right," Reverend Brooks said weakly. Let's proceed then." The ceremony was brief, stripped of all the ornamental language, reduced to its essential core. "Do you take this woman?" "I do. Do you take this man?" Elena signed her response, and her Aunt Martha, who'd found her voice, called out, "She says yes. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife." Colt didn't kiss her. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently, a gesture that felt more intimate than any kiss could have been in that moment. Then he turned to the crowd and spoke words Elena read with perfect clarity. "The reception's canceled. She's been through enough today." He guided her down the aisle, his hand at her elbow, steady and sure. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses, too stunned to do anything but stare. Elena kept her eyes forward, her chin high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. They emerged into brilliant Montana sunlight, and Elena took her first breath as a married woman, to a man whose last name she'd learned 5 minutes ago, whose first name was apparently Colt, whose face she'd never seen before today. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing that had happened to her in months. A wagon waited at the church's hitching post, simple, functional, pulled by 2 sturdy horses. Colt helped her up onto the bench, his movements gentle and careful, treating her like she was valuable instead of broken. Then he climbed up beside her, took the reins, and guided the horses away from the church, away from the town, away from the life that had just ended, and toward whatever came next. Elena looked back once. The crowd had spilled out onto the church steps, watching them leave, 100 faces reflecting various shades of shock and scandal and barely suppressed outrage. She saw her Aunt Martha, hands pressed to her mouth, saw Thomas, his face twisted with fury, saw the whole town bearing witness to the day Elena Wells stopped being the deaf girl they pitied and became the woman who chose her own rescue. Then she turned forward, toward the mountains rising in the distance, toward the ranch Colt had mentioned, toward the complete unknown that was somehow less frightening than the known cruelty she was leaving behind. The wind caught her hair, pulled strands loose from the pins she'd so carefully arranged that morning. She'd come to church as one person's burden and left as another person's choice. Not his property, not his obligation, his choice. Beside her, Colt drove in silence, his eyes on the road, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested this kind of dramatic rescue was just another Thursday for him. Elena studied his profile, the strong jaw, the slight sunburn across his nose, the way his hair curled at his collar because he probably couldn't remember the last time he'd gotten a haircut. He looked like someone who'd forgotten how to care what others thought, who'd built a life beyond the reach of small-town judgment. After about a mile, he turned to her and spoke slowly. "I know this is strange. I know you have questions. When we get to the ranch, I'll write everything down for you. We'll figure this out together. But right now, I just wanted to say..." He paused, making sure she was watching his lips. "You didn't deserve any of that. What they did in there, what he did. You deserved better." Elena's throat tightened. She nodded because it was all she could manage. Her hands moved into the signs for "thank you," the gesture feeling wholly inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd done. Colt smiled slightly. "You're welcome." They rode on, leaving Deerhorn Crossing behind, the town shrinking to a collection of tiny buildings against the vast Montana landscape. With every mile, Elena felt something loosening in her chest. Not hope, exactly, because hope still felt too dangerous to name. But maybe its precursor. Maybe the possibility of possibility. The ranch revealed itself gradually as they crested a rise. A modest house of weathered wood, a barn that needed fresh paint, corrals and outbuildings scattered across land that rolled toward distant mountains. It wasn't grand, but it was honest, just as Colt had promised. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was keeping the home fires burning. Cattle dotted the pastures, their presence promising sustainability, if not prosperity. Colt pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, then came around to help Elena descend. His hands at her waist were respectful, professional, setting her down gently before stepping back to give her space. "Welcome home," he said, and the words carried none of the irony such a statement should have held under the circumstances. He meant it. This stranger, this man she'd met an hour ago in the most dramatic fashion possible, was offering her not just shelter, but belonging. The front door opened and a woman emerged, older, maybe 60, with iron gray hair pulled into a practical bun and an expression that suggested she'd seen too much of life to be easily surprised. But Elena's arrival clearly qualified as surprising because the woman stopped short, her eyes widening as she took in the white dress, the disheveled hair, the general appearance of someone who'd survived their own wedding. Colt made introductions through simple gestures and exaggerated lip movements. "Elena, this is Mrs. Sarah Chen. She keeps the house running and cooks better than any restaurant in 3 states. Sarah, this is Elena. She's my wife as of about 30 minutes ago. It's a long story." Sarah's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. She looked at Colt, then at Elena, then back at Colt. Then she did something Elena wasn't expecting. She smiled. Not a pitying smile, not a condescending smile. A genuine expression of warmth. She moved her hands in signs that were unpracticed but recognizable. "Welcome. You safe here?" Elena's eyes burned. The woman had learned to sign, at least a basic greeting. Someone in this house had anticipated the need for her language. She signed back, "Thank you." Sarah nodded decisively and gestured toward the house. "Come. I make tea. You rest." Inside the house was simple but clean, rough-hewn furniture that favored function over style, floors swept daily, windows that let in generous light. It smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and something baking that made Elena realize she hadn't eaten since dawn. The front room opened into a kitchen where a pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the space with the aroma of beef and vegetables and herbs. Sarah guided Elena to a chair at the kitchen table and pressed a cup of tea into her hands. The warmth seeped through the ceramic, grounding her. Colt sat across from her, pulled a slate and chalk from a drawer, and began to write. His handwriting was neat, practical. The letters formed with the care of someone who'd learned early that clarity mattered. "I know you must be confused. I know this isn't what you expected when you woke up this morning. I'm going to explain everything, but first, are you all right? Do you need anything? Water, food, a moment alone?" Elena shook her head, signed, "I'm fine." "But yes," confused. Colt nodded and began writing again, his chalk scratching across the slate in long, patient strokes. "My name is Colt Brenner. I'm 31 years old. I've owned this ranch for 8 years. Bought it with money I saved working cattle drives from Texas to Montana. It's 640 acres of decent grazing land, enough cattle to keep me solvent, a few horses, chickens, the usual. I'm not wealthy, but I'm not poor. I work hard, pay my debts, try to be decent. I was in town today to deliver beef to the butcher. I saw the crowd at the church and got curious. Wasn't planning to attend, but something made me walk closer. I heard the laughter through the open doors. Heard what that bastard said to you, and I saw you start to fall. I don't tolerate cruelty, can't stand it, never could. My mother was Shoshone. My father was a rancher from Virginia who met her during the fur trade days. They married despite everyone telling them it was wrong, that it wouldn't work, that they were too different. They were happy for 23 years until a fever took them both the same winter. I grew up watching how people treated my mother, the looks, the comments, the exclusion. She was the most capable, intelligent, kind woman I've ever known, and people treated her like she was less than human because she was different from them. It made me angry then. Makes me angry now. When I saw you in that church, being humiliated by small people who wouldn't recognize courage if it spit in their eye. I saw my mother, not because you're the same, you're your own person, but because I recognize the specific kind of cruelty that targets people for being different. So I intervened. Maybe it was reckless. Probably was, but I couldn't stand there and watch. Colt paused, looked up from the slate to meet Elena's eyes. He spoke aloud as he wrote, "As for the marriage, that's up to you. We can have it annulled if you want. I won't hold you to vows spoken under duress. But if you choose to stay, I'll honor my commitment. I'll give you a safe home, honest work, and respect. I won't demand anything you're not willing to give. We can figure out the rest as we go." Elena read the words twice, then a third time. This man, this stranger, had upended his entire life to spare her humiliation, had married her not out of desire or obligation or convenience, but out of principle. It was the most absurd, reckless, generous thing anyone had ever done for her. Her hands moved slowly, forming signs she hoped he could understand. "You don't know me," Colt wrote. "True. But I know what I saw. That's enough for now. I can't hear, I can't speak properly. I'll be—" She struggled for the sign, settled for spelling it burden. Colt's response was immediate, his chalk striking the slate with emphasis. "You're not a burden, you're a person. Those aren't the same thing, and we'll learn to communicate. I'm not worried about that." He erased the slate, wrote fresh words. "Stay tonight, rest. Tomorrow we'll talk more. No pressure, no demands. Just a roof over your head and time to think. Fair?" Elena looked at this man who'd given her an escape route without asking for anything in return. Looked at Sarah, who was busy ladling stew into bowls with the comfortable efficiency of someone secure in their place. Looked around this simple house that felt more welcoming than anywhere she'd been in years. She signed, "Fair." Colt smiled, a full smile this time that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Good." Sarah set bowls before them, along with thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. They ate in companionable silence, the kind that felt natural rather than awkward. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched shadows across the yard, painting everything in shades of gold. Cattle lowed in the distance, vibrations Elena could feel more than hear. A dog she hadn't noticed before trotted past the window, tongue lolling in canine contentment. After dinner, Sarah showed Elena to a bedroom, small but clean, with a quilt on the bed and curtains at the window and a pitcher of fresh water on the washstand. It wasn't her room from her father's ranch, wasn't anywhere she'd ever been, but it felt safer than any place she'd slept in months. "You rest," Sarah signed, her movements careful. "Tomorrow, new day." Elena nodded her thanks and closed the door. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment, still in her wedding dress, still trying to process the fact that she'd woken up that morning as Elena Wells, had been briefly Elena Grady for about 30 seconds, and was now Elena Brenner, married to a man she'd met at the altar, living in a house she'd never seen, her entire life redirected in the space of an hour. She should be terrified, should be panicking, planning escape, calculating risks. Instead, she felt something she hadn't felt since her father died, the possibility of peace. Elena changed out of the dress, her mother's dress, her grandmother's dress, the weight of family history she'd carried up that aisle. She folded it carefully and set it in the empty wardrobe, a relic of a different life. Then she lay down on the bed in her shift and stared at the ceiling, watching shadows move across whitewashed boards as the sun set beyond the window. She thought about Thomas's face when Colt had called him a coward, thought about the congregation's shock when a stranger defended her more fiercely than anyone ever had, thought about Colt's hands catching her before she fell, steady and sure, treating her like someone worth catching. Outside her window, the world was settling into evening. She couldn't hear the birds that must be singing their twilight songs, couldn't hear the wind moving through the pines, couldn't hear the normal sounds that marked the transition from day to night, but she could feel the house around her, solid, stable, sheltering. Could feel the slight vibration of footsteps as Colt or Sarah moved about below. Could feel, for the first time in so long, that she wasn't entirely alone. Elena closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her down into sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own complications, its own questions, its own negotiations of this strange new reality. But tonight, she could rest. Tonight she was safe, and that was more than she'd had when she woke up this morning, more than she'd expected when she walked into that church, more than she'd dared to hope for when the laughter started. In the room below, Colt sat at the kitchen table with a book he'd ordered from a catalog in Billings, The American Manual Alphabet, a guide to fingerspelling and sign language. He'd bought it months ago, after meeting a deaf ranch hand at a cattle auction. The man had been skilled, hardworking, but struggled to find stable employment because people assumed his deafness made him less capable. Colt had hired him for the season, learned enough signs to communicate basic instructions, and been impressed by how much more efficiently they could work once language wasn't a barrier. He'd kept the book, kept practicing signs in his spare time, thinking maybe someday it would be useful. He hadn't expected someday to be today, hadn't expected to need it for his wife, a wife he'd acquired in the most impulsive decision of his life. Sarah sat across from him, mending one of his shirts by lamplight. She hadn't asked questions, hadn't demanded explanations, just accepted the situation with the pragmatic grace of someone who'd survived too much to waste energy on shock. "You did a good thing today," she said finally, her accent carrying the lilt of her native Cantonese even after 40 years in America. "Did a reckless thing," Colt corrected. "Good remains to be seen." "Same thing sometimes." Sarah bit off a thread, examined her work. "That girl, she has strong spirit. I see it in her eyes. She survived much already." "I know." Colt turned a page, studying the signs for basic household words. "That's why she deserves better than what she was getting." "And you give her better?" Sarah's tone was gently challenging. "I'll try." Colt looked up from the book. "I can't promise perfect, but I can promise honest." "That's more than she was getting from Grady." Sarah nodded slowly. "You're like your father. He see your mother. He see person. Everyone else see something else. He teach you good." "He taught me right from wrong," Colt said. "Everything else is just details." He returned to the book, memorizing signs, practicing movements with his rough rancher's hands. Upstairs, Elena slept, safe, sheltered, no longer alone. Outside, Montana night settled over the land like a blanket, stars emerging one by one in a sky vast enough to hold both hope and history. And in a church in Deerhorn Crossing, the scandal of the day was just beginning to spread. The story of how the deaf girl who came to marry one man left with another, how a stranger had called them all cruel and been right, how sometimes the most unexpected mercy came from the most unexpected places. But that was the town's story to tell. Here, at the ranch, a different story was beginning. Quieter. Simpler. Built not on words spoken aloud, but on choices made in silence, on kindness offered without expectation, on the radical notion that every person deserved dignity regardless of what they could or couldn't hear. And though neither of them knew it yet, this unlikely beginning, born from humiliation and rescue, from principle and impulse, would become the foundation of something neither had expected to find. A partnership built on mutual respect, a marriage that honored silence as much as sound, and a love that would prove stronger than judgment, deeper than pity, and more enduring than any vow spoken in a church full of laughter. But that story would unfold in its own time. For now, on this strange wedding night, it was enough that Elena slept safely, and Colt studied signs by lamplight, both of them taking the first tentative steps into a future they'd build together. One word, one gesture, one act of kindness at a time. The moon rose over the Montana mountains, painting the world in silver light. And in a small ranch house 15 miles from town, two strangers married by circumstance and choice began the work of becoming something more. Partners, friends, and eventually, though they couldn't know it yet, the kind of love that changes not just two lives but an entire community's understanding of what it means to truly hear another human soul. Elena woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains, the confusion of displacement settling over her like morning fog. For 3 disoriented heartbeats, she couldn't remember where she was. Then yesterday crashed back in waves. The church, the laughter, Thomas's rejection, and the stranger with storm cloud eyes who'd caught her when she fell. She sat up slowly, her wedding dress still folded on the chair where she'd left it, a ghost of a life that had ended before it began. The floor was cold against her bare feet as she crossed to the washstand. Someone, Sarah probably, had left fresh water in the pitcher and a clean towel folded beside it. Elena poured water into the basin and splashed her face, the shock of cold helping to anchor her in this new reality. She was married, to a man named Colt Brenner, living in a ranch house she'd never seen before yesterday. The sheer improbability of it should have sent her spiraling into panic, but instead she felt oddly calm, as if some part of her had been waiting her whole life for permission to stop fighting and just exist. She dressed in the only other clothes she owned, a simple brown skirt and cream blouse she'd packed in the small bag her aunt had brought to the church. When she opened the bedroom door, the scent of coffee and bacon drifted up the stairs, rich and inviting. Elena descended carefully, her hand trailing along the banister, emerging into the kitchen where Sarah stood at the stove, and Colt sat at the table with that same book from last night, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up when her shadow crossed the threshold, and his face brightened with a smile that felt genuine rather than obligatory. He stood, a gesture of respect that caught her off guard, and pulled out a chair for her. Sarah immediately set a plate before her, eggs, bacon, biscuits with butter and honey, more food than Elena usually ate for breakfast, presented without fanfare or expectation. Colt reached for his slate, wrote quickly, "Did you sleep well?" Elena nodded, signed, "Yes, thank you." He studied her hands, then consulted his book, flipping through pages until he found what he was looking for. His own hands moved slowly, clumsily forming shapes that approximated signs. Good. Today, we talk. The signs were rough, unpracticed, several of them technically incorrect, but the effort behind them struck Elena harder than perfect fluency would have. He was trying. This man who'd known her less than 24 hours was already working to speak her language rather than demanding she adapt to his. She signed back slowly, exaggerating each movement so he could follow. "You are learning." Colt's smile turned sheepish. He wrote, "Trying to. I'm not very good yet, but I ordered this book months ago. Seemed useful. Didn't expect to need it quite like this." "Why did you buy it?" Elena signed, then pointed to the slate so he'd write his answer. "Met a deaf ranch hand last year. Good worker, skilled, but people wouldn't hire him because they assumed he couldn't do the job. I hired him for the season. We figured out how to communicate, mostly gestures and written notes. But I thought if I learned proper signs, it would be easier. He taught me a few basics before he moved on to Wyoming. I've been practicing since." Elena read the words twice. Most people never bothered learning sign language even for family members, let alone for a seasonal worker they'd never see again. Yet Colt had purchased an expensive book, had spent his evenings practicing signs for someone who wasn't even there anymore. It spoke to character in ways declarations never could. Sarah set a cup of coffee before Colt, squeezed Elena's shoulder gently as she passed, a simple gesture of solidarity that made Elena's throat tight. These people, these strangers, were treating her with more kindness in one morning than most people had shown her in years. They ate in comfortable quiet, the morning sun painting everything gold. Through the window, Elena could see the ranch spreading out, cattle grazing in distant pastures, chickens pecking in the yard. A dog, the same one from yesterday, lying in a patch of sunlight with the contentment only dogs achieved. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost foreign after months of tension. When breakfast was finished, Colt gestured toward the door, signed something that was probably supposed to be outside, but looked more like bird flying. Elena bit back a smile at his earnest confusion. She corrected the sign gently, showing him the proper movement. He practiced it 3 times, nodding when he got it right, then stood and offered his hand. They walked out into Montana morning, the air crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and pine. Colt led her around the property, pointing out the various buildings. The barn where he kept 6 horses, the chicken coop that Sarah ruled with absolute authority, the smokehouse, the workshop where he repaired equipment. He wrote descriptions on a small notebook he'd brought, his handwriting quick but legible. The ranch is 640 acres. I run about 200 head of cattle, mostly Herefords. They're good beef cattle, hardy, do well in this climate. I have contracts with butchers in 3 towns. It's steady income, not spectacular, but reliable. They stopped at the corral where 2 horses stood, one a bay mare and the other a gray gelding with kind eyes. Colt reached into his pocket, produced 2 withered apples, handed one to Elena. The gelding came to the fence immediately, his nose searching for treats with single-minded determination. "This is Ash," Colt said aloud, speaking slowly so she could read his lips. "He's stubborn but trustworthy. The mare is Sage. She's temperamental but fast." Elena offered the apple to Ash, who took it with gentle teeth, his whiskers tickling her palm. She'd always loved horses, had grown up riding on her father's ranch, had found solace in their company when human company became too complicated. Ash finished his apple and bumped her hand with his nose, seeking more attention. She stroked his face, feeling the warmth of his breath, the silk of his coat. Colt watched her, then wrote, "Do you ride?" "Yes," she signed, then added with her hands, "My father taught me. Before." "Before he died?" Colt wrote. Elena nodded. The grief was still there, still sharp when she poked at it, but time had begun its slow work of transforming pain into something more bearable. She missed her father desperately, missed his laugh, his stubborn pride, his absolute conviction that their ranch would survive despite all evidence to the contrary. But she'd learned that missing someone and living your life weren't mutually exclusive. Sage could use exercise, Colt wrote. If you want a ride, she's yours to use whenever you like. All I ask is, you tell me when you're going out so I know to expect you back. The casual way he offered it, not as permission granted but as a resource shared, struck Elena as significant. He wasn't establishing himself as an authority figure who controlled her movements. He was treating her as a partner with agency, someone whose safety mattered but whose autonomy wasn't negotiable. "Thank you," she signed, the gesture carrying more weight than two simple words usually held. They continued walking, Colt pointing out landmarks. The creek that ran through the eastern section of the property, the stand of cottonwoods where he'd built a small cabin his first year, now used for storage, the north pasture where he planned to expand next year if cattle prices held steady. He wrote about his plans with the unselfconscious enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his work, who saw land not as something to conquer, but as something to steward. When they reached a small rise overlooking the main house, Colt stopped and turned to face her. His expression was serious but not unkind, the look of someone about to have a difficult conversation and determined to do it right. He pulled out his notebook, wrote carefully, "We need to talk about our arrangement, what this marriage is and isn't, what we both expect." Elena's stomach tightened. Here it came. The terms and conditions, the fine print she'd been waiting for. Nothing was ever truly free. She'd learned that lesson young and hard. But Colt's next words surprised her. "First, I want to be clear. You're not a servant. You're not here to cook and clean and make my life easier. Sarah handles the house and gets paid well for it. If you want to help her, that's your choice. But it's not required or expected." He paused, looked up to make sure she was following, then continued. "Second, your room is your room. I won't enter without permission. I won't expect or demand anything physical from you. If that changes someday because we both want it to change, fine. But there's no obligation. This marriage started as a rescue, not a romance." Elena read the words, then reread them. Most men would have considered a wife their property, entitled to whatever they wanted whenever they wanted it. The fact that Colt was explicitly stating otherwise, was drawing boundaries that protected her rather than him, felt almost revolutionary. "Third," he wrote, "this is your home now. Not my home that I'm letting you stay in. Your home. You have every right to it that I do. You can change things, move things, make it yours. I'm not a tyrant, and this isn't a prison." He looked at her directly, his gray eyes serious. "I know you don't know me. I know you have no reason to trust me beyond what you've seen, but I'm asking you to give this a chance. Give me a chance to prove I mean what I say, and if at any point you want to leave, I'll help you. I'll give you money, transportation, whatever you need to start fresh somewhere else. You're not trapped here." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she signed. "Why? Why would you do all this?" Colt was silent for a long moment, staring out at the mountains. When he finally wrote his answer, the words came slowly, as if he was still figuring them out himself. "Because I watched my mother be treated like she was less than human her entire life. Because I saw how cruelty dressed itself up as social norms. Because I learned young that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing, and I decided I'd rather be reckless than complicit." He turned to face her fully. "You deserved better than what you were getting. Still do. I'm not perfect, and this situation is strange as hell, but I can promise you decency. That's not negotiable." Elena felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but blooming. This man, this stranger, was offering her something she'd stopped believing existed, unconditional human dignity. Not because she'd earned it, not because he wanted something in return, but because he believed it was her right simply by virtue of existing. Her hands moved carefully, forming signs she hoped would convey what words couldn't. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Colt replied, speaking aloud while signing clumsily along. "Just think about it. Take your time." There's no rush to figure everything out today. They stood on that rise for several minutes, the Montana wind moving around them, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle that Elena couldn't hear but could feel in the vibration of the earth beneath her feet. Below them, the ranch house looked small and sturdy, smoke rising from its chimney in a straight line toward the sky. It was the kind of moment that felt suspended outside of time, as if the universe had paused to let them catch their breath before moving forward. Finally, Elena signed. "Can I see the book? The one you're learning from?" Colt's face lit up. "Of course." They walked back to the house where he retrieved the manual, its cover worn from repeated handling. Elena sat at the kitchen table and began flipping through pages, seeing where he'd marked certain sections with strips of paper, where he'd made notes in the margins practicing vocabulary. He'd gotten some signs wrong. His note for hungry was actually the sign for thirsty, but the effort was so sincere, so wholehearted, that the mistakes felt endearing rather than inadequate. She looked up to find him watching her anxiously, as if her approval mattered, as if he was genuinely concerned he might have offended her somehow. The vulnerability in his expression undid something she'd been holding carefully in place since yesterday. "You're doing well," she signed slowly, then reached for his slate to write. "But let me help. I can teach you correctly." The relief on Colt's face was palpable. I'd like that a lot." So began the first real conversation of their marriage, conducted not in spoken words, but in the slow, patient building of a shared language. Elena started with basics. Yes, no, please, thank you, hungry, tired, happy, sad. Colt practiced each sign multiple times, his large hands learning to form shapes they'd never made before. He was clumsy at first, fingers getting tangled, movements too stiff or too exaggerated. But he kept trying, kept asking her to correct him when he got it wrong, kept pushing through frustration with determination. Sarah joined them after finishing her morning chores, learning alongside Colt with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who saw language as a tool rather than an academic exercise. She was quicker than Colt, her smaller hands finding the shapes more easily, but she deferred to Elena completely, asking permission before attempting each new sign. They worked through lunch, Sarah making sandwiches that they ate between lessons. Colt asked questions Elena had never been asked before. How did she know when someone was at the door? Did she feel music through vibrations? What were the most frustrating situations she encountered? He listened, truly listened to her answers, taking notes, asking follow-up questions, treating her experiences as valuable information rather than curiosities. "Do you read lips?" he asked at one point, speaking slowly. "Yes," Elena signed, then wrote on the slate, "But it's not perfect. Some words look the same, fast talkers are difficult, and it only works if I can see your face clearly." "So if I turned away while speaking, you wouldn't know what I was saying," Colt said, more statement than question. Elena nodded. "Good to know." He made a note in his book. "I'll make sure to face you when talking, and if we're in different rooms, I'll—" He paused, thinking. "I could stomp? Would you feel that?" Elena almost laughed, would have if the gesture hadn't felt rusty from disuse. She signed, "Depends on the floor. But yes, vibrations help." "Right." Another note. "We'll figure it out." The afternoon passed in this fashion, building bridges between their worlds one sign at a time. Colt showed her around the house more thoroughly, the pantry stocked with provisions for winter, the root cellar keeping things cool, the parlor with its comfortable chairs and surprisingly extensive bookshelf. He'd collected volumes on everything from animal husbandry to astronomy, their spines cracked from repeated reading. "I like to learn things," he said simply when she asked about the books. "Never had much formal education, but I can read. Figured I should take advantage of it." Elena ran her fingers along the spines, recognizing some titles, discovering others. One caught her attention, "The Deaf and Dumb Man's Tutor," an old text on sign language and deaf education. She pulled it out, examined the publication date, 1820. Colt saw what she'd found, looked embarrassed. "That was my grandmother's. She had a deaf brother. Most of it's outdated, but some of the signs are still used. I learned a few basics from it when I was a kid, though I'd forgotten most of them until recently. So his interest in deaf communication wasn't new, wasn't just inspired by one seasonal worker. It was woven into his family history, part of who he'd been long before he met her. Elena held the book carefully, feeling the weight of generations in its pages. That evening, after Sarah had gone home to her own small cabin on the property, and the sun was painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple, Colt built a fire in the parlor and gestured for Elena to join him. She sat in one of the chairs, and he took the other, the space between them comfortable rather than awkward. He'd been practicing something she could tell. His hands moved with more confidence as he signed, "I want to know about you." Elena blinked, surprised. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," he signed back, then laughed at his own ambition and reached for his slate. "That's too broad. Let me start smaller. What do you like to do? What makes you happy?" No one had asked her that in so long, Elena had to think. Her life had been so consumed by survival, by managing her father's decline and then his death, by trying to arrange a future that wouldn't leave her destitute, that happiness had become theoretical. Finally, she wrote, "I like to sew. I'm good at it. Detailed work, mending, making things. I like horses and being outside. I like reading, though I didn't have many books. I like when the sun comes through windows in the morning. I like the smell of rain, even though I can't hear it." Colt read her words carefully, then wrote, "The sewing room upstairs has good light. My mother used it. There's a machine up there, fabric scraps, supplies. It's yours if you want it, and you can read any book here. I'll get you more if you want different ones." "You don't have to—" Elena started to sign, but he cut her off gently. "I know I don't have to. I want to. There's a difference." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling, vibrations Elena could feel through the floor. Outside, night was settling over the ranch, stars beginning to emerge in the vast Montana sky. This time yesterday, she'd been preparing for a wedding that would have destroyed her spirit slowly, day by day. Now she was sitting in a warm house with a man who asked what made her happy, who'd given her a room of her own and a horse to ride and books to read, and expected nothing in return. "Why aren't you afraid?" Elena signed suddenly, the question surprising herself as much as him. "Afraid of what?" Colt signed back. "Of me. Of this." Her hands moved faster now, emotion making her gestures sharp. "You married a stranger. You brought her to your home. You don't know what I'm like, what problems I might bring, what burdens—" "Stop." His sign was firm but not harsh. He reached for his slate, wrote quickly, "You're not a burden, and I'm not afraid because I can see who you are. You walked into that church knowing you'd face mockery. You were willing to marry a man you didn't love to honor your father's debts. You held your head high when people laughed at you. That takes strength, takes courage. Those are good qualities to have in a partner." "Partner?" Elena wrote on her own slate, her handwriting shaky. "That's what marriage is supposed to be, isn't it? Partnership. Two people making life easier for each other, supporting each other, building something together. Not ownership, not servitude. Partnership." Elena stared at the words, this radical reimagining of what marriage could be. In her experience, marriage had always been transactional. Women traded domestic labor and childbearing for financial security. Men traded financial support for household management and social standing. Love, when it existed, was a fortunate accident rather than a foundation. But Colt was describing something different entirely, something that sounded almost impossible in its equity. "Have you been married before?" she wrote. "No. Came close once, a woman named Catherine from Silver Bend. But she wanted me to sell the ranch, move to a bigger town, become someone I wasn't. I couldn't do it. We parted ways. That was 5 years ago. Been single since." "Do you want children?" The question felt presumptuous, but Elena needed to know what expectations existed in the shadows of his generosity. Colt was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally wrote his answer, the honesty was almost painful. "Someday, maybe. If I found the right partner and we both wanted them. But not as an obligation. Children should be chosen, wanted, loved, not just produced out of duty. My parents had me because they wanted to be parents, not because society expected it. That's how it should be." He looked at her directly. "What about you?" Elena had never let herself think about it. Children required a stable future, a willing partner, circumstances she'd never expected to have. But the question made her realize she'd avoided it, not out of lack of interest, but out of self-protection. "I don't know," she wrote honestly. "Maybe someday, but not now, not yet." "Fair enough," Colt wrote. "Not now, not yet. But someday is still possible. That's something." They talked long into the night, the conversation ranging from practical matters, how they'd divide chores, what schedule worked best, whether she wanted her own horse or could share Sage, to deeper topics. Colt told her about his parents, about growing up straddling two worlds, about learning early that most people's opinions weren't worth the breath spent voicing them. Elena wrote about her childhood, about realizing she was deaf around age 3, about her mother's determination to teach her sign language despite everyone saying it was pointless, that Elena should just learn to read lips and speak normally. "Your mother sounds like she was amazing," Colt signed, his movements still clumsy but sincere. "She was," Elena signed back, then added, "She died when I was 7. Fever. After that, it was just my father and me. He tried, but he didn't know the signs. We figured out our own way of communicating, gestures, expressions, written notes, but it was lonely sometimes." Colt reached across the space between their chairs, offered his hand palm up, an invitation, not a demand. Elena looked at it for a long moment, this gesture of connection from a man who'd turned her entire life sideways in the space of a day. Then she placed her hand in his, felt his fingers close gently around hers, warm and calloused and steady. "You're not alone anymore," he signed with his free hand, the movement unpracticed but clear. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena believed it might be true. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and dark and full of stars Elena couldn't see from where she sat, but knew were there anyway, constant and distant and indifferent to human struggles. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new negotiations of this unlikely partnership. But tonight, in this moment, with her hand held gently in his and the promise of partnership hanging in the air between them, Elena felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of drowning people reaching for driftwood, but quiet hope, steady hope, the kind that whispered maybe things could be different, maybe kindness wasn't just a temporary aberration, maybe she'd stumbled into something that could actually last. When she finally stood to go to bed, exhaustion pulling at her bones, Colt walked her to the stairs. He signed goodnight, still clumsy, still learning, but trying. She signed it back, then added, "Thank you. For everything." "You don't have to keep thanking me," he signed. "This is just what decent people do." But Elena shook her head. "No, it's what you do. Most people aren't like you." She left him standing at the base of the stairs, his expression thoughtful in the dying firelight. As she climbed to her room, she could feel him watching, not with possession or expectation, but with something gentler. Care, maybe. Or the beginnings of it. In her room, Elena changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, the quilt soft and smelling of lavender. Through the window, she could see the barn outlined against the star-filled sky, could see the dark shapes of cattle in distant pastures, could see the vast Montana landscape spreading out in all directions. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, not with sadness, but with something bigger than she had words for. She'd woken up yesterday morning expecting to sacrifice herself on the altar of obligation, had walked into that church prepared to marry a man who saw her as a burden he was reluctantly assuming, had been ready to spend the rest of her life making herself small enough to justify her existence. Instead, she'd found a stranger who'd looked at her and seen a person worth defending, who'd upended his life without hesitation to spare her humiliation, who was learning her language, honoring her autonomy, offering partnership instead of ownership. It was too much to process all at once. Too big, too strange, too good to trust completely. But as Elena drifted towards sleep, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she'd been rescued not by a man, but by the possibility of a different kind of life entirely. One where her silence wasn't a deficit to overcome, but simply part of who she was. One where she could take up space without apologizing. One where she wasn't alone. Downstairs, Colt banked the fire and checked the locks. following the nighttime routine he'd established over 8 years of solitary living. But nothing felt quite the same. The house held different energy now, not just his space, but shared space. Tomorrow he'd teach her more signs, show her how the ranch operated, continue building this unlikely partnership into something sustainable. He wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy. They were still strangers learning each other's languages, literally and figuratively. There would be misunderstandings, frustrations, moments where the gulf between their experiences felt unbridgeable. But Colt had built a ranch from nothing, had learned to thrive in country that broke lesser men. He could learn to build a marriage the same way, with patience, with effort, with commitment to seeing it through. As he climbed the stairs to his own room across the hall from Elena's, he found himself hoping she'd stay, that she'd give this strange arrangement a real chance. Not because he needed a wife, he'd been content enough alone, but because he suspected they could build something good together, something that honored both of them equally. That possibility felt worth fighting for. The house settled into night quiet, two people sleeping under one roof for the first time as husband and wife. Their marriage unconventional and their future uncertain, but the foundation of it built on something solid: mutual respect, genuine kindness, and the revolutionary notion that every person deserved dignity regardless of what made them different from the majority. Outside, the wind moved through the sage, stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and Montana night kept its vigil over the land. And in a small ranch house 15 miles from town, two strangers who'd become partners began the slow work of building trust, one sign, one gesture, one act of grace at a time. The days that followed took on a rhythm Elena hadn't expected. Not the suffocating predictability of obligation, but the gentle cadence of two people learning to orbit each other without collision. She woke each morning to sunlight painting her room gold, dressed in clothes that were hers to choose, and came downstairs to find Colt already at the kitchen table, practicing signs with the dedication of a man learning scripture. "Good morning," he'd sign, the movement still stiff but improving daily. Some mornings he got it wrong, his hands forming shapes that meant something entirely different, once accidentally signing good gravy instead, which had made Sarah laugh so hard she'd burned the bacon. But he kept trying, kept asking for corrections, kept filling notebooks with sketches of hand positions and notes about which fingers went where. Elena found herself looking forward to these morning lessons, the way Colt's face would light up when he finally mastered a difficult sign, the furrow between his brows when he struggled with subtle distinctions. He was a terrible student in some ways, impatient with his own mistakes, frustrated when his large rancher's hands couldn't quite achieve the grace the language required. But he was also relentless, refusing to give up on signs that gave him trouble, practicing until muscle memory took over. By the end of the first week, they could hold basic conversations without slate or paper. Nothing complex, simple exchanges about meals and chores and weather. But the fact that they could communicate at all in her language rather than constantly translating to his felt revolutionary. For the first time in her life, Elena wasn't the one doing all the accommodating. Sarah proved to be an unexpectedly quick learner, her hands finding the shapes with an ease that made Colt mutter good-natured complaints about being shown up. She'd come each morning and greet Elena with increasingly complex signed conversations, her face splitting into broad smiles when Elena praised her progress. The older woman had a gift for languages. She explained through a combination of signs and writing. She spoke Cantonese, English, and passable Spanish, had picked up bits of Shoshone from Colt's mother. Adding sign language to her repertoire felt natural. "Words are just words," Sarah signed one morning while kneading bread dough, her hands moving between the dough and the signs with practiced efficiency. "Different shapes, same purpose. Connect people." Elena helped where she could without being asked, not out of obligation, but because idleness felt wrong after a lifetime of constant work. She'd wander into the kitchen and find herself chopping vegetables alongside Sarah, the two of them working in companionable silence that felt like conversation anyway. She'd take over the mending pile that lived in a basket by the fire, her needle moving through fabric with the precision of long practice. Small contributions that Sarah accepted with nods of appreciation rather than expectations of more. Colt kept his promise about the sewing room. The second morning, he'd led her upstairs to a room at the back of the house that caught the eastern light perfectly. Inside sat a treadle sewing machine, a good one, a singer that must have cost a fortune, along with a cutting table, shelves stocked with fabric remnants and thread in every color imaginable, and a comfortable chair positioned near the window. "My mother's," Colt signed, then switched to his slate when the explanation grew too complex for his limited vocabulary. "She loved to sew, made all our clothes, quilts, curtains, everything. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to touch any of it. But it's just been sitting here for 8 years. She'd hate that. She'd want someone to use it." Elena had run her fingers over the machine's smooth metal, testing the treadle, feeling the mechanism respond to her foot's pressure. It was beautifully maintained. Someone, probably Colt, had kept it oiled and functional even when no one was using it. "Are you sure?" she'd signed, the question encompassing more than just the room. Colt had nodded firmly. "It's yours. All of it. Make whatever you want." So Elena had claimed the space, spending hours at the machine, relearning the rhythm of foot and hand working together. She started with practical things, mending Colt's work shirts where seams had pulled, reinforcing Sarah's apron where the fabric had worn thin, hemming curtains that had been dragging the floor. But gradually, she grew more ambitious. She found a length of blue calico in the fabric stash and made herself a new dress, the first clothing she'd owned that wasn't a hand-me-down or charity case. The act of creating something just for herself, something chosen and made with care, felt like a small rebellion against every year she'd spent making do. When she wore it to breakfast 3 weeks after arriving, Colt's face had broken into a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You made that?" he'd signed, and when she nodded, he'd added, "It's beautiful. You're talented." The compliment had settled warm in her chest, not because she needed his approval, but because it was given freely, without expectation of anything in return. He noticed things, the small efforts she made, the ways she was settling into the space, the gradual relaxation of her shoulders as days passed without crisis. And he acknowledged them, not with grand gestures, but with quiet recognition that felt more valuable than praise. The ranch work continued around her like a river flowing around a stone, and gradually Elena began to understand its rhythms. Colt rose before dawn, spent the morning checking cattle and mending fences and doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch functional. He'd return for lunch, his clothes dusty and his face sunburned, and spend the midday hours in the barn or workshop before heading out again until dinner. It was hard work, physical and relentless, but he never complained, never seemed to resent it. He'd chosen this life deliberately, and the satisfaction he took in it showed in every movement. Elena started joining him sometimes, riding sage alongside his gelding Ash, learning to read the land the way he did. He'd point out where the good grazing was, where the creek ran strongest, where he'd found a cow birthing twins last spring. He'd show her the fence line that needed replacing before winter, the pasture he was planning to seed with new grass, the section of barn roof that leaked when it rained. He taught her like she was a partner who needed to understand the business, not a wife who could be kept ignorant of practical matters. One afternoon, 3 weeks into her residence, they rode to the northern boundary where Colt's land met his neighbor's property. The neighbor, a man named Frank Morrison, was out checking his own fence line and waved when he saw them approaching. Elena tensed instinctively. New people meant new judgments, new opportunities for her difference to become the central fact of any interaction. But Colt simply signed to her, "Neighbor, Frank, good man," before riding forward to greet Morrison. The two men talked for several minutes, their conversation invisible to Elena from where she sat on sage. She saw Morrison glance her direction several times, saw Colt's posture shift slightly, not defensive, but alert, protective. Finally, Colt gestured for her to join them. Elena rode forward, her stomach tight with anticipation of however this interaction would unfold. Morrison was weathered and gray, probably in his 60s, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to be surprised by much. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture of respect that immediately eased some of her tension. Colt signed and spoke simultaneously. "Frank, this is my wife, Elena. Elena, Frank Morrison. He runs the property north of here." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Clearly, this was the first he'd heard of Colt's marriage, but his expression settled quickly into acceptance. "Ma'am," he said, then looked at Colt. "Didn't know you'd gotten married. Congratulations." "Recent development," Colt replied with a slight smile. "Elena's deaf, so she reads lips." Just face her when you're talking and speak clearly. Morrison nodded, turned to address Elena directly. Welcome to the area, Mrs. Brenner. If you folks need anything, my wife and I are just over the ridge. Always happy to help neighbors. The casual acceptance, the way he simply adjusted his behavior to accommodate her needs without making it a production, caught Elena off guard. She signed her thanks, and Colt translated, "She says thank you. We appreciate it." "Your husband's teaching you sign language?" Morrison asked, and when Colt nodded, he grinned. "Good for you. My brother was deaf, lost his hearing to scarlet fever as a kid. I learned some signs growing up. Don't remember much, but..." He raised his hands, formed a clumsy but recognizable sign for friend. Elena felt her throat tighten. She signed back friend, correcting his hand position slightly, and Morrison laughed. "See, that's what I get for not practicing. But the offer stands. You need anything, you let us know." He tipped his hat again and rode off, leaving Elena staring after him in bemusement. "Told you he was a good man," Colt signed with a satisfied expression. "Does he really have a deaf brother?" Elena signed back. "Had. Passed away a few years back, but yeah, Frank's always been decent about differences. Comes from experience, I guess." They rode home through the golden afternoon light, and Elena found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't known she'd been tense. Not everyone was going to be kind, she knew that, had learned it too many times to ever forget. But maybe not everyone was going to be cruel either. Maybe there were more people like Colt and Frank and Sarah than she'd believed, people who saw difference as just another fact rather than a defect requiring correction. That evening, Colt returned from the barn with a package wrapped in brown paper, his expression carrying that particular mix of pride and nervousness that suggested a surprise he wasn't sure would be well received. He set it on the table in front of Elena, signed, "For you." Elena unwrapped it carefully, her hands hesitating over the string. Inside, she found books, 3 of them, their covers still stiff with newness. The first was a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson. The second was a novel, Little Women, which Elena had heard of but never read. The third made her breath catch, The Deaf Mute's Friend, a periodical for the deaf and dumb. She looked up at Colt, questions in her eyes. He signed slowly, supplementing with his slate when he ran out of vocabulary. "I rode to Silver Bend yesterday. There's a bookstore. I asked if they had anything by or about the deaf community. The owner ordered these, said the periodical comes monthly if you want to subscribe. It has stories and articles by deaf people about deaf experiences. I thought maybe you'd like to read perspectives from people who understand." Elena's vision blurred. She'd never read anything written by another deaf person, had never encountered stories that reflected her own experience. The isolation of being the only one, the assumption that her silence meant she had nothing to say, those had been constants in her life. The idea that somewhere out there, deaf people were writing, publishing, creating communities of shared experience felt almost impossible to believe. "Thank you," she signed, the gesture too small for what she was feeling. Colt smiled. "You're welcome. And there's more. The bookstore owner said there's a school for the deaf in Boulder. Been there about 5 years. If you ever wanted to visit, meet other people who sign, we could take a trip." The offer hung in the air between them, enormous in its implications. He wasn't trying to keep her isolated, wasn't threatened by the idea of her connecting with others like herself. He was actively facilitating it, spending money and time to give her access to a community she'd never known existed. Elena set the books down carefully and stood, moving around the table to where Colt sat. He looked up at her, uncertain, and she did something she'd been thinking about for days but hadn't had the courage to attempt. She hugged him. Not romantically, not with any expectation of more, just a simple embrace of gratitude, her arms wrapping around his shoulders, her face pressed against his sun-warmed shirt that smelled of sage and honest sweat. Colt went still for a heartbeat, then his arms came up to return the embrace, gentle and careful, holding her like she was something valuable that might break if handled roughly. They stood like that for several seconds, this first real physical connection between them, that wasn't about rescue or necessity, but about genuine affection. When Elena pulled back, she saw his eyes were bright with emotion he wasn't quite hiding. "I'm glad you're here," he signed, the movement slower than usual, weighted with sincerity. "Me too," Elena signed back, and realized she meant it completely. This strange marriage, this unlikely partnership, this house and ranch and life she'd stumbled into by accident. Somewhere along the way, it had stopped feeling like exile and started feeling like home. That night, Elena sat in her room reading the periodical by lamplight, devouring every word. There were stories about deaf students learning trades, about deaf couples building lives together, about the debates raging in the deaf community about oralism versus sign language. There were poems that captured the frustration of being constantly misunderstood, essays about the beauty of visual language, letters from readers sharing their experiences. For the first time in her life, Elena felt seen by people who'd never met her, understood by strangers who knew exactly what her silence meant and didn't mistake it for emptiness. She fell asleep with the periodical open on her chest, her dreams full of possibilities she'd never allowed herself to imagine. A world where being deaf wasn't a deficit to overcome, but simply a different way of experiencing life. Where sign language was celebrated rather than hidden. Where people like her weren't isolated but connected in communities of shared understanding. Downstairs, Colt sat at the kitchen table practicing the sign for love. Not because he needed it for any immediate conversation, but because he could feel them building towards something that might require it eventually. His hands moved through the gesture over and over, arms crossing over his heart, the universal sign for love in American Sign Language. It felt presumptuous to practice it, felt like he was getting ahead of himself. They'd been married a month, and it was still mostly practical partnership, still careful and cautious and respectful of boundaries. But he couldn't deny what he felt developing beneath the surface. A genuine fondness for this woman who'd entered his life in chaos and settled into it with quiet grace. The way she'd light up when she mastered a new sewing technique. The way she'd laugh silently when he butchered a sign but keep patiently correcting him anyway. The way she'd started humming while she worked, even though she couldn't hear the sounds she was making. She was beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with her face and everything to do with her spirit. And Colt was beginning to understand that rescuing her had been the most selfish thing he'd ever done because he was the one being saved. He put the books away and climbed the stairs, pausing outside Elena's door where lamplight still glowed beneath the frame. He could knock, but she wouldn't hear it. Could open the door, but that felt like an invasion of the privacy he'd promised her. So he did what he'd started doing. He tapped his foot against the floor in a rhythm that created vibrations, waited to see if she responded. The lamplight shifted, and then the door opened. Elena stood there in her nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the periodical still in her hand, her expression soft with contentment. "Sorry to disturb," Colt signed. "Just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed." "I have everything," Elena signed back. "Thank you for the books, for understanding why they matter." "Of course they matter," Colt signed. "You matter. Your experience matters. Your community matters." Elena's smile was radiant in the lamplight. She signed goodnight, and Colt returned the gesture, then retreated to his own room. But sleep was slow in coming, his mind too full of this woman across the hall, this unexpected partnership that was becoming something more complicated and more wonderful than he'd anticipated. The next morning brought rain, the first real rain since Elena's arrival. She woke to the vibration of thunder rolling through the house, to the change in air pressure that signaled storms even when you couldn't hear them coming. Through her window, she watched lightning flash across dark clouds, watched rain sweep across the valley in visible sheets. She couldn't hear the thunder's roar or the rain's percussion against the roof, but she could feel the storm's power in the way the house trembled slightly with each thunderclap, could see it in the way the wind bent the grasses flat. Downstairs, Colt was already up, coffee made, and breakfast started. He saw her enter and signed, "Big storm. We stay inside today. Good day for lessons." So they spent the rainy day at the kitchen table, expanding their shared vocabulary. Colt had prepared a list of words he wanted to learn, more complex concepts now that they'd mastered the basics. Words like frustrated, confused, worried, excited, grateful. Emotions that couldn't be reduced to simple happy or sad. Feelings that required nuance to express. Elena taught him each sign carefully, explaining the subtle differences between similar emotions. Frustrated had a sharp cutting quality to its movement. Worried was circular, repetitive, like thought spinning without resolution. Grateful placed his hand over the heart and moved outward, like giving part of yourself away in thanks. Colt practiced each one, his face scrunched in concentration. When he signed grateful, He held Elena's gaze and signed it again, slower, making sure she understood he wasn't just practicing. He meant it. She signed it back, the gesture passing between them like a gift. Sarah arrived mid-morning, soaked despite her oilskin coat, and immediately started baking. The kitchen filled with the scent of bread and cinnamon rolls, warmth pushing back against the storm's chill. She joined their lessons between tasks, her hands dusted with flour as she practiced signs for kitchen implements and cooking techniques. "How do you sign delicious?" she asked, and Elena showed her, fingertips to the lips, then the hand moving away in satisfaction. Sarah repeated it, then signed it toward Colt with a teasing expression, and they all laughed at the easy familiarity that had developed between them. The storm raged outside, but inside the house felt like a sanctuary, warm and dry, and full of the simple pleasure of people learning to understand each other better. This, Elena thought, was what family was supposed to feel like. Not blood relation, not legal obligation, but chosen connection, deliberate kindness, the decision to keep showing up for each other even when it was inconvenient. By afternoon, the rain had settled into steady persistence, the kind that would last all day and into the night. Colt built a fire in the parlor, and they migrated there with books and mending and Sarah's knitting. Elena curled into one of the comfortable chairs with Little Women, losing herself in the March Sisters world. Occasionally, she'd look up and catch Colt watching her, his expression unguarded and gentle, and he'd smile before returning to his own book, a technical manual about cattle breeding that looked spectacularly boring, but that he read with genuine interest. As evening approached and Sarah prepared to brave the rain for her walk home, Colt signed to Elena. "I need to check the barn. Make sure nothing's leaking. Want to come?" Elena set down her book, nodded. They bundled into oilskin coats and dashed across the muddy yard, the rain immediately soaking any exposed skin. Inside the barn, it was dry and dim, the air thick with the smell of hay and horses, and the rain drumming on the roof in rhythms Elena couldn't hear but could feel through the floorboards. Colt moved through the space, checking for leaks, testing the stalls, making sure the horses had plenty of feed and water. Elena wandered to Sage's stall, ran her hand down the mare's soft nose. The horse whickered. Elena felt the vibration against her palm and pressed into her touch with the shameless affection of an animal who knew it was loved. When Colt finished his inspection, he joined her at the stall, leaning against the wooden rail beside her. He didn't sign, didn't speak, just stood there in companionable silence while they both petted the horse. It was such a simple moment, so ordinary, but Elena felt its significance anyway, the ease of being together without needing to fill the space with words, the comfort of presence without performance. Finally, Colt turned to her, his expression serious. He signed slowly, choosing his words with care. "Are you happy here?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Elena considered it honestly, searching her feelings for truth rather than politeness. Was she happy? The word felt almost too simple for what she was experiencing. She wasn't the giddy, careless happiness of youth that had been beaten out of her by circumstance long ago, but she was content, peaceful, hopeful. She woke each morning without dread, went to sleep each night without fear. She had purpose and autonomy, and people who cared whether she was all right. That was more than happiness. That was security, dignity, belonging. "Yes," she signed finally. "I'm happy here." Colt's relief was visible, tension draining from his shoulders. "Good, because I want you to know this isn't temporary. This is your home, for as long as you want it to be." "Even though we're still strangers?" Elena signed, adding a slight smile to show she was half teasing. "We're not strangers anymore," Colt signed back. "Maybe we don't know everything about each other yet, but we're not strangers. We're partners. Friends, I hope." "Friends," Elena agreed, signing the word with the same careful deliberation he'd used. They walked back to the house through the rain, and this time Elena didn't mind the cold water soaking through her coat because she was too busy thinking about what Colt had said. Partners, friends, the foundation of something that might someday become more. But only if they both chose it, only if it grew naturally from mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation or convenience. That night, After Sarah had gone and they'd eaten dinner and cleaned up together, Colt sat down at the kitchen table with his slate and wrote something he'd apparently been planning all day. I want to tell you something. When I was a kid, maybe 12 or 13, my mother sat me down and explained that marriage in our world, the world of people who crossed cultural boundaries, had to be built differently than traditional marriages. It couldn't rely on shared assumptions or cultural scripts because we existed between worlds, not fully in either one. She said the only way those marriages survived was if both people committed to constant communication, to never assuming they understood without checking, to building their own culture together rather than trying to force each other into existing molds. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how our marriage is like that, not because of culture, exactly, but because we're building something that doesn't fit the normal pattern. We're creating our own language, literally and figuratively, our own rules, our own way of being together. I just wanted you to know that I'm committed to that, to figuring it out together, to not assuming I know what you need but asking instead, to building something that works for both of us, even if it looks strange to everyone else. Elena read it twice, her chest tight with emotion. She picked up the slate, erased his words carefully, and wrote her own response. I've spent my whole life trying to fit into a world that wasn't designed for me, trying to be less silent, less different, less of a burden. And I was ready to keep doing that with Thomas, to shrink myself small enough that maybe he wouldn't resent me too much. But you've never asked me to be smaller. You've only asked me to be honest, and you've done the same, shown me who you are without pretense or performance. That's the most valuable gift anyone has ever given me. I'm committed too, to figuring this out, to building something together that honors both of us, to being brave enough to trust that this might actually work. Colt read her words, and when he looked up, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been lamplight reflecting strangely. He reached across the table, offered his hand palm up the way he had that first night. Elena placed her hand in his, felt his fingers close warm and steady around hers, and they sat like that while the rain drummed on and the fire crackled and the house held them both in its shelter. Outside, Montana night pressed close, the storm obscuring the stars and turning the world small and immediate. But inside, two people who'd started as strangers and become partners were building something that felt increasingly like the beginning of love, the kind that grew slowly and deliberately, rooted in respect and watered with daily acts of kindness, the kind that might actually last because it was chosen rather than imposed, nurtured rather than assumed. And though neither of them said it aloud or signed it yet, they both felt it growing in the space between them. The possibility that this strange marriage might become the realest, truest thing either of them had ever known. The morning Colt suggested they ride into Deerhorn Crossing together, Elena's first instinct was refusal. 6 weeks had passed since the wedding that wasn't, since she'd left that church as Colt's wife instead of Thomas's burden, and the thought of facing those people again made her stomach clench with remembered humiliation. But Colt had supplies to pick up, business to conduct at the land office, and he'd signed his request with such casual confidence in her strength that refusing felt like admitting defeat. "We don't have to," he'd added quickly when he saw her hesitation. "I can go alone, but I thought maybe it was time to show them you're doing just fine without their approval." So Elena had nodded, changed into her new blue calico dress, and climbed onto Sage with her chin held high and her heart hammering against her ribs. They rode the 15 miles in comfortable silence, Colt occasionally pointing out landmarks or signing comments about the cattle they passed. The closer they got to town, the tighter Elena's grip became on the reins, until Colt reached over and touched her arm gently. "You're not the same person who walked into that church," he signed with one hand, the other still holding Ash's reins. "You're stronger now. And you're not alone." The reminder helped, but when they crested the final rise and Deerhorn Crossing spread out before them, the same weathered buildings, the same dusty main street, the same church steeple reaching toward indifferent sky. Elena felt 6 years old again, small and different and utterly certain that she didn't belong. They hitched the horses outside Murphy's General Store, and immediately Elena felt eyes turning their direction. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the boarding house, her hand flying to her mouth. Old Ben Crawford stopped mid-stride on the boardwalk, staring openly. Two women Elena didn't know well, the banker's daughters, she thought, leaned close to whisper, their gazes sharp with curiosity and judgment. Colt offered Elena his arm with deliberate formality, a public declaration of partnership that everyone could see. She took it, grateful for the solid warmth of him beside her, and they walked into the store together. Marcus Murphy stood behind the counter, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, awkwardness, and a desperate attempt at normalcy. "Colt," he said, nodding. Then, turning to face Elena directly so she could read his lips. "Mrs. Brenner, good to see you both." The use of her married name, the respectful tone, the effort to address her properly. It was more than Elena had expected. She signed her thanks, and Colt translated. "She appreciates that, Marcus. We need supplies. The usual order, plus some extra fabric if you've got decent selection." While Marcus assembled their order, other customers filtered in and out, each one doing double takes when they saw Elena. Some nodded politely, clearly uncertain how to react. Others stared with undisguised fascination, as if she were an exotic animal that had wandered into town. A few turned and left immediately, apparently unable to handle the social complexity of her presence. Then Mabel Crawford walked in, Elena's childhood friend who'd abandoned that friendship when it became socially inconvenient. Mabel stopped short when she saw them, color rising in her cheeks. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Mabel approached slowly, her hands twisting the strings of her reticule. "Elena," she said, speaking clearly and directly. I heard you got married, to Mr. Brenner." She glanced at Colt, then back to Elena. "I wanted to say, I'm glad that you're well, that things worked out." It wasn't an apology, was an acknowledgement of the years she'd ignored Elena's existence, hadn't defended her when others mocked her silence, but it was something, a small olive branch extended in public, where others could see, which took its own kind of courage. Elena signed a response, and Colt translated. "She says thank you. She's doing well." Mabel nodded, relief evident on her face. "If you ever want to visit, for tea or—" She trailed off, the invitation hanging incomplete in the air between them. Elena considered it, the girl Mabel had been versus the woman she'd become. The friendship that had meant everything versus the abandonment that had taught Elena who she could really trust. Finally, she signed, "Maybe someday." Colt translated, and Mabel nodded again, accepting the conditional forgiveness for what it was. She purchased her items quickly and left, but something had shifted in the store's atmosphere. People were watching, reassessing, recalculating their assumptions about the deaf girl who'd married the strange rancher. They were loading supplies into the wagon when Thomas Grady appeared, his face mottled with anger that had apparently been simmering for 6 weeks. He strode toward them with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd convinced himself he'd been wronged, his mouth already moving in words Elena could read clearly. "You think you can just show up here like nothing happened? Like you didn't make a fool of me in front of the whole town?" Colt stepped between Thomas and Elena, his posture shifting into something dangerous. "We came to town for supplies, that's all. You want to make it into something else, that's your choice. But choose carefully." "She was mine," Thomas spat, and Elena felt rage ignite in her chest at the possessive pronoun, at the casual way he claimed ownership of another human being. "We had an arrangement. You had no right—" "She's not property," Colt interrupted, his voice dropping to something cold and deadly. "She's a person, and she was never yours. You bought her father's debts, not a human being. The fact that you can't tell the difference is exactly why she's better off married to anyone else on earth." Thomas's face went purple. His hand moved toward his belt, whether reaching for a weapon or just a threatening gesture, Elena couldn't tell. But Colt caught his wrist before he could complete the motion. "Don't," Colt said quietly. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. Because I promise you, I've dealt with better men than you trying worse things. You really want to test me in the middle of Main Street where everyone's watching?" Indeed, a crowd had gathered, merchants stepping out of shops, townspeople stopping mid-errand to witness the confrontation. Elena saw Frank Morrison among them, his hand resting casually on his own gun belt, his expression making it clear whose side he'd take if this escalated. Saw Mrs. Henderson watching with wide eyes. saw Marcus Murphy standing in his store doorway, ready to intervene. Thomas jerked his wrist free, his chest heaving. "This isn't over," he said, the threat obvious even if the specifics weren't. "Yes," Colt replied calmly. "It is. It was over the moment you decided to humiliate her in that church. You made your choice. Now live with it." He turned his back on Thomas, a deliberate insult, a statement of how little threat he considered the man, and helped Elena into the wagon. As they pulled away, Elena looked back once and saw Thomas still standing in the street, fury and humiliation warring on his face while the crowd dispersed around him, their whispers no doubt already spreading this new chapter of scandal. They were a mile out of town before Elena's hand stopped shaking enough to sign, "Thank you for standing up for me, again." "You don't have to thank me for treating you like a human being," Colt signed back with one hand, the other managing the reins. "That's just basic decency. Thomas is a coward and a bully. He only had power over you because circumstances gave it to him. Now circumstances are different." "He's dangerous," Elena signed. "Angry men do stupid things." "I know," Colt replied. "I'll be careful. We'll both be careful. But I'm not going to let fear of him control our lives. We have just as much right to exist in this world as he does." They rode in silence for a while, the town shrinking behind them. Elena felt the tension slowly draining from her shoulders, replaced by something that might have been pride. She'd faced them, faced Thomas, faced the town, faced all the judgment and curiosity, and she'd survived. More than survived. She'd walk through it with her head high, Colt solid and steady beside her, and come out the other side intact. "Did you see Mabel?" Colt signed after a few miles. "That took courage, to approach you in front of everyone." "It's not enough," Elena signed back. "One apology doesn't erase years of abandonment." "No," Colt agreed. "But maybe it's a start. People can change. Not everyone does, but some people can." Elena considered this, watching the mountains rise in the distance, solid and eternal and utterly indifferent to human drama. Maybe he was right. Maybe people could change. She certainly had. The girl who'd walked into that church 6 weeks ago barely resembled the woman riding home now. She'd found her spine again, the part of herself that had been slowly crushed under the weight of obligation and loss. Found it and polished it until it shone. When they reached the ranch, Sarah was waiting with fresh bread and the kind of intuitive understanding that came from experience. She took one look at their faces and signed, "Town was difficult?" "Thomas made a scene," Colt signed back, "but we handled it." Sarah nodded like this was expected, unsurprising. "Men like him always make scenes. Is his nature. But you're safe here. This is home." That word, home, settled into Elena's chest and stayed there, warm and certain. This was home. Not the place she'd been born, not the ranch her father had died trying to save, but this weathered house with its creaking floors and comfortable furniture and people who chose to be kind. Home was a choice, she was learning, a decision made daily to show up, to care, to build something together. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Elena was working in the sewing room when she felt the vibrations of boots on the stairs, heavier than Colt's tread, unfamiliar rhythm. She turned from the machine to find Frank Morrison's wife standing in the doorway, a basket over her arm and an expression that mixed nervousness with determination. "Mrs. Brenner," she said, speaking slowly and clearly, "I'm Dorothy Morrison, Frank's wife. I hope it's all right that I came by. Sarah let me in." Elena stood, uncertain of the protocol here. Dorothy was probably in her late 50s, gray-haired and sturdy, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades on the frontier. She held out the basket. "I brought some preserves, peach and strawberry, and I wanted to welcome you properly to the area. Should have come sooner, but..." She trailed off, shrugged. "Better late than never, I suppose." Elena took the basket, signed her thanks. Dorothy watched the gesture carefully, then attempted to copy it, clumsy but earnest. "Thank you," she said aloud. "Is that right?" Elena nodded, correcting her hand position slightly. Dorothy smiled, tried again, got it right. "Good. I want to learn some. If you don't mind teaching me." "I never got to learn properly with Frank's brother. He was older, moved away before I married into the family, but I always wished I had. They went downstairs where Sarah was preparing lunch, and the three women fell into an easy rhythm, Dorothy asking questions about signs, Elena teaching, Sarah translating when needed. Dorothy proved to be a quick student and a gifted storyteller, regaling them with tales of her 40 years in Montana territory, of winters that buried houses to the roof lines, and summers that baked the ground hard as stone. "I heard what happened at your wedding," Dorothy said eventually, her tone matter of fact rather than pitying. "The whole territory heard, honestly. Scandal travels faster than good news. But I also heard how Colt stood up for you. That man is exactly like his father, sees injustice and can't abide it. Jack Brenner was the same way, good man, raised his son right." "You knew Colt's parents," Elena signed and Sarah translated. "Knew them well. Jack and I were friends for years before he met Morningstar. That was Colt's mother's name, though most white folks couldn't be bothered to use it. She was remarkable, intelligent, capable, kind, but people treated her terribly because she was Shoshone. Jack didn't care what people thought, loved her fiercely until the day they died. Colt learned from watching them, learned that love means standing up for someone even when it costs you." The words settled over Elena like a revelation. She'd known Colt's parents had an unconventional marriage, but understanding the specifics, the social costs they'd paid, the courage it had required, the legacy they'd left their son, made her comprehend Colt's actions in a new light. He hadn't just rescued her on impulse. He'd been raised by people who believed that human dignity was non-negotiable, that love was a verb requiring action, that silence in the face of cruelty was its own kind of violence. Dorothy stayed for lunch, and by the time she left, Elena had gained not just a neighbor but a friend, someone who saw her as a person first and deaf second, who was willing to learn her language, who offered companionship without pity. After she'd gone, Sarah signed to Elena with a knowing smile. "Good people find good people. You're building community. This is important." The weeks that followed brought more visitors, neighbors Elena hadn't met, ranchers who did business with Colt, even a few women from town who'd apparently been shamed by Dorothy's example into extending olive branches of their own. Not everyone was kind, and Elena still faced her share of stares and whispers and people who spoke about her like she wasn't there. But the ratio was shifting. For every person who treated her as broken, there were two who treated her as simply different, and one or two who didn't see her deafness as relevant at all. Colt's sign language improved dramatically with constant practice. By the 8th week of their marriage, they could have actual conversations without resorting to slate and paper, discussions about ranch business, about books they were reading, about their pasts and dreams and the small observations that made up daily life. His hands still formed some signs incorrectly. His grammar was often backwards, but they understood each other. That was what mattered. One evening in early autumn, with the first hints of cold creeping into the air, Colt asked Elena to teach him about her childhood. Not just the facts, but the experience of it, what the world had been like through her eyes. They sat by the fire, and Elena signed slowly, giving him time to follow. She told him about realizing she was different around age 3, when other children responded to sounds she couldn't hear. About her mother's determination to teach her sign language despite everyone saying it would make her lazy, that she should focus on lip reading and speaking normally. About her father's grief after her mother died, how he'd tried his best but didn't know the signs, so they'd invented their own crude system of gestures and written notes. About the isolation of being the only deaf person she knew, of never seeing herself reflected in stories or histories or the people around her. It was like being invisible and hypervisible at the same time, she signed. People wouldn't talk to me directly, would ask my father, "What does she want?" like I wasn't standing right there. But they'd also stare constantly, like I was a curiosity. I was either ignored or gawked at, never just seen. Colt watched her hands, his expression intense with concentration and something deeper, empathy maybe, or recognition. When she finished, he signed back, "My mother felt the same way. She'd tell me stories about walking into stores and having white women clutch their children close, like she was dangerous, about men speaking to my father about her while she stood right there, as if she was deaf herself. Being different makes people uncomfortable, and they punish you for their own discomfort." How did she survive it? Elena signed. How did she stay kind? My father, Colt signed simply. He loved her so completely, so publicly, that it gave her armor against the cruelty. She'd say that one person truly seeing you was worth 1,000 people misunderstanding you. And she had him. That was enough. The weight of what he wasn't saying hung in the air between them, the parallel he was drawing, the hope he was carefully not voicing. Elena felt it too, this growing understanding that they were building something similar to what his parents had shared. Not the same circumstances, but the same foundation. Two people choosing each other despite the world's disapproval, creating their own culture together, finding in partnership the strength to withstand judgment. The next morning, Elena woke to find a note slipped under her door, written in Colt's neat handwriting. There's something I want to show you. Dress warm. We'll be gone most of the day. Curious, Elena dressed in her riding clothes and found Colt waiting with both horses saddled and a pack of supplies. He signed, "Trust me?" And when she nodded, he helped her mount and led them east, away from town, toward the mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against the autumn sky. They rode for hours, climbing gradually into terrain Elena had never explored. The air grew thinner, colder, scented with pine and the first hints of coming snow. Colt navigated confidently, clearly following a route he knew well, occasionally pointing out landmarks, a lightning-struck tree, a distinctive rock formation, a creek bed that would flood in spring. Finally, they emerged into a meadow that took Elena's breath away. It sat high in the foothills, surrounded by stands of aspen whose leaves had turned brilliant gold, the grass still green despite the advancing season. A small cabin stood at the meadow's edge, weathered but intact, smoke rising from its chimney suggesting someone had been there recently. Colt dismounted and helped Elena down, then led her to the cabin. Inside, it was simple but comfortable. One room with a fireplace, a table and chairs, a bed frame with a fresh mattress, shelves stocked with supplies. The fire was burning cheerfully, warming the space against the mountain cold. "This is my thinking place," Colt signed, settling into one of the chairs and gesturing for Elena to take the other. "I built it 5 years ago, after Catherine and I parted ways. Needed somewhere to go when the ranch felt too crowded with memories. I come up here a few times a year, stay for a day or two, just exist without having to perform for anyone." "It's beautiful," Elena signed, looking around at the simple space, the windows that framed views of mountains and meadow and endless sky. "I wanted to share it with you," Colt signed, "because you've shared so much with me, your language, your experiences, your trust, and because I think you understand what it means to need space that's just yours, where you can be completely yourself without filtering or accommodating or explaining." He stood, moved to the shelves, and pulled down something wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, Elena saw a small wooden box, beautifully carved with patterns that looked distinctly Shoshone. Colt opened it carefully, revealing its contents: a necklace of turquoise and silver, a pair of beaded moccasins, a leather-bound journal filled with writing in 2 different hands, and a photograph, faded but clear, showing a young couple, the man obviously Colt's father, and the woman beside him, dark-haired and regal, wearing traditional Shoshone dress. "My parents," Colt signed. "This is what I have left of them. I keep it here because at the ranch, I sometimes forget who I am. Get too caught up in being the rancher, the businessman, the person everyone expects me to be. But up here, with their things, I remember I'm also my mother's son, that I come from people who refuse to be diminished by others' opinions." He held out the photograph to Elena, and she took it carefully, studying the faces. Colt's father was handsome in a rugged way, his arm wrapped protectively around his wife. But it was Colt's mother who drew the eye. She looked directly at the camera with an expression of quiet dignity, her beauty undeniable but secondary to the intelligence and strength evident in every line of her face. Elena could see where Colt had gotten his storm cloud eyes, his strong features, his air of absolute certainty in his right to exist exactly as he was. "She would have liked you," Colt signed, taking the photograph back and returning it gently to the box. "She would have recognized in you what my father recognized in her, someone who'd been underestimated their whole life but never diminished, someone whose difference made them stronger, not weaker." Elena felt tears prickling her eyes. I wish I could have met her. Me too, Colt signed. But in a way, you already have. Everything I learned about standing up for people, about respecting differences, about building partnerships instead of hierarchies, I learned from watching them. So when you see me trying to be decent, you're seeing her legacy. You're meeting her through me. They spent the day at the cabin, talking about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing naturally now that they'd built enough shared language to express complex thoughts. Colt told her stories about growing up between cultures, about his mother teaching him Shoshone traditions while his father taught him ranching, about learning early that he'd never fit comfortably in either world, so he'd have to create his own. Elena shared memories of her mother, of the joy she'd found in discovering sign language as a child, of feeling like she'd finally found her voice even though it made no sound. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the meadow in shades of gold and amber, Colt signed something that made Elena's heart stutter in her chest. I'm falling in love with you. I wanted you to know. No pressure, no expectations, just truth. You deserve truth. Elena stared at him, this man who'd caught her when she fell and kept catching her every day since, who'd learned her language and defended her dignity and shared his most precious memories with her. She thought about the past 2 months, how her life had been completely transformed, how she'd gone from resigned to rescue to genuinely happy. Thought about how her chest felt tight when he smiled, how she looked forward to their morning lessons, how she'd started thinking of the ranch not as his place where she stayed, but as their home they shared. Her hands moved before she could second-guess herself. I think I'm falling in love with you too. Colt's face transformed, not just a smile, but pure joy radiating from every feature. He stood slowly, offered his hand, pulled her gently to her feet when she took it. They stood facing each other in the golden light streaming through the cabin windows. And Colt signed with one hand while his other still held hers. Can I kiss you? Elena nodded, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he must be able to see it. Colt cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with infinite gentleness, then leaned down and kissed her softly, carefully, asking a question with every movement. Elena answered by leaning into him, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat strong and rapid beneath her palm. The kiss deepened slowly, building from gentle exploration to something more urgent, more certain. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers and signed, Is this okay? Are we okay? Better than okay, Elena signed back, and kissed him again to prove it. They rode home as the sun set, painting the sky in impossible colors, and Elena felt like she was glowing from the inside out. This strange marriage that had started as rescue had become something real, something chosen, something that felt like the beginning of forever. They'd built it slowly, carefully, with respect and patience and daily acts of kindness, and now it was transforming into something neither had expected but both desperately wanted. When they reached the ranch, Colt helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. He signed, Thank you for giving this a chance, for giving me a chance. Thank you for seeing me, Elena signed back. Really seeing me. Not the deaf girl everyone pitied, just me. That night, Elena lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, too wound up to sleep. Everything had changed, and nothing had changed. She was still in the same room, still in the same house, still married to the same man. But now there were words between them that hadn't existed before. Love, spoken aloud through the language of their hands. Now there was a future she could actually imagine, one where she wasn't just surviving, but thriving, where her silence was just one fact among many rather than the defining fact, where she was loved, not despite her difference, but with full awareness of it. Across the hall, Colt wasn't sleeping either. He was thinking about Elena's hand signing I love you, about the way she'd kissed him in the meadow cabin, about how thoroughly she'd upended his carefully controlled life and made it infinitely better. He'd rescued her, but she'd saved him. From loneliness, from the assumption that he'd spend his life alone, from the belief that his parents' kind of love was rare enough that he'd never find it himself. And in the morning, they'd wake and have breakfast and continue learning each other's languages and building this strange, wonderful partnership into something that could withstand anything the world threw at them. Because they'd already survived the worst, the judgment, the mockery, the public humiliation, and come out stronger. Everything else was just details. The first snow came early that year, arriving in mid-October with the quiet insistence of something that knew it belonged. Elena woke to a world transformed. Everything outside her window painted white and pristine, the familiar landscape made strange and beautiful by overnight accumulation. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Colt already at the window, coffee in hand, watching the snow fall with an expression that mixed appreciation with calculation. Winter meant different challenges, different routines, and she could see him mentally cataloging what needed to be done. He turned when he felt her footsteps vibrating through the floor, his face brightening the way it always did now when he saw her. "First snow," he signed, then added with a slight smile, "You picked a good year to marry a rancher. Means a harsh winter ahead, but good moisture for spring grass." They'd settled into their new dynamic over the past weeks. Still partners, still friends, but now also genuinely in love, though they were taking their time with the physical aspects of marriage. Colt had moved some of his belongings into Elena's room, but they were navigating intimacy slowly, carefully, making sure every step forward was mutual and wanted. It was refreshingly different from what Elena had expected marriage to be. Not obligation or duty, but choice renewed daily. That morning, while they were having breakfast and watching the snow accumulate, Sarah arrived with news that made them both look up sharply. She signed rapidly, her movements urgent. "Boy coming, on the road, walking, looks lost." They all went to the door, and Elena saw what Sarah meant, a small figure trudging through the snow toward the house, moving with the exhausted determination of someone who'd been walking for a long time. As he got closer, Elena could see he was young, maybe 8 or 9, his coat too thin for the weather, his boots leaving uneven tracks like he was favoring one foot. Colt was already moving, pulling on his own coat and heading out to meet the boy. Elena watched from the doorway as he reached the child, saw them have a brief conversation, saw the boy sag with relief. Then Colt lifted him, gently, carefully, and carried him toward the house. Inside, they settled the boy by the fire while Sarah heated soup and wrapped him in blankets. His lips were blue with cold, his hands shaking as he tried to hold the warm mug Colt pressed into them. When he'd warmed enough to speak, Colt asked the obvious questions, making sure Elena could see his face to read his lips. "What's your name, son? Where are you from?" "Danny," the boy said, his voice hoarse. "Danny Fletcher, from Silver Bend. I was trying to get to Billings." "That's 60 miles from here," Colt said gently. "Why were you walking alone?" Danny's face crumpled, tears mixing with melting snow on his cheeks. "My pa died last month. Pneumonia. My ma couldn't take care of all of us. She sent me to my uncle in Billings, put me on the stage 2 days ago, but..." He stopped, his small frame shaking with more than cold. "But what?" Colt pressed gently. "The stage driver. He was mean, started saying I was stupid because I didn't answer him fast enough, said I was ignoring him. I tried to tell him I couldn't hear good. Fever when I was little took most of my hearing, but he got madder and madder, said I was lying, said I was a troublemaking brat. Finally just put me off the stage, middle of nowhere. Told me to walk if I was too good to answer him proper." Elena's hands clenched into fists. She knew exactly what that felt like. Being punished for a difference you couldn't control, being called lazy or stupid or defiant simply because you couldn't hear. She moved closer to Danny, knelt beside his chair so she was at his eye level, and signed slowly. "You're safe now. We'll help you." Danny stared at her hands, then at her face, his expression transforming from confusion to wonder. You know the hand language? Like at the deaf school?" Elena nodded, signed again. "I'm deaf. I use signs. Do you know some?" "A little," Danny said, his cold hands forming clumsy shapes. "Ma taught me a few. She knew a deaf lady once, but not many. Just basics." "That's good," Elena signed. "More than most people know. You're not stupid. You're not troublemaking. You're just hard of hearing, and that driver was cruel." Colt had been watching this exchange with an expression Elena was learning to read. He was planning something, working through possibilities in his mind. When Danny had finished his soup and stopped shivering, Colt signed and spoke simultaneously. "We're going to get you to your uncle, but not today. Storm's too bad. You'll stay here tonight, get warm and fed and rested. Tomorrow, we'll take the wagon to Billings. All of us." "I don't want to be trouble," Danny said, his voice small. "You're not trouble," Elena signed firmly. "You're a child who was treated badly by an adult who should have known better. That's not your fault." They set Danny up in the spare room, gave him clean clothes that had belonged to Colt as a boy, fed him a proper meal while Sarah clucked over him like a determined hen. And that evening, by the fire, Elena began teaching him more signs, basic vocabulary he could use to communicate when speaking was difficult or when people weren't listening properly. Danny proved to be a quick learner, his young hands forming shapes more easily than Colt's had at first. He absorbed every sign eagerly, practiced them over and over, his face lighting up with each new word he mastered. When Elena taught him the sign for home, he repeated it slowly, his expression wistful. "I miss home," he signed, then added aloud, "But Ma said there wasn't enough food for all of us. Said my uncle would take better care of me than she could. I think she was ashamed, that I can't hear right, like it made me less valuable." The words hit Elena like physical blows. She'd felt that shame radiating from her own father sometimes, seen it in the way he'd apologize for her to strangers, as if her deafness was a personal failing he needed to explain. She signed carefully, making sure Danny was watching. "Your value doesn't come from your hearing. It comes from who you are. Your kindness, your courage, your heart. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth your shame." Colt added, speaking slowly so both Danny and Elena could follow. "The problem isn't that you can't hear well. The problem is that people won't make the effort to communicate with you properly. That's their failing, not yours." Danny absorbed this, his young face serious with thought. Then he signed a question to Elena. "Does it get easier? Being different?" Elena considered lying, telling him what he wanted to hear. But she'd built her life with Colt on honesty, and this child deserved the same. She signed truthfully. "Sometimes yes, sometimes no. You'll meet cruel people who won't try to understand, but you'll also meet good people who will. The trick is learning to value the good people's opinions and ignore the cruel people's. That's what strength really is, not pretending you're not different, but refusing to be ashamed of it." They talked long into the evening, this strange gathering of people bound by difference and understanding. Sarah shared stories of arriving in America speaking no English, of being mocked for her accent and appearance, of learning that cruelty often came from ignorance rather than malice. Colt told Danny about his mother, about growing up between two worlds, about choosing to build his own path rather than trying to fit into someone else's expectations. And Elena taught more signs, not just words, but phrases, concepts, ways of expressing complex emotions through movement and position. Danny soaked it all up like parched ground drinking rain, and Elena realized this was what she wanted to do. Not just survive her own deafness, but help others like her survive theirs. Teach them the language she'd found so late. Give them the tools she'd never had as a child. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the snow having stopped overnight, leaving the world crystalline and bright. They loaded into the wagon, Colt driving, Elena beside him, Danny and Sarah bundled in the back among blankets and heated stones to keep them warm. The journey to Billings would take all day, maybe longer depending on road conditions, but Colt had prepared thoroughly, packing supplies for any eventuality. As they traveled, Elena taught Danny more signs, their hands moving in the frigid air while their breath plumed white. Other travelers passed them on the road, freight wagons, a few riders, another stage that made Danny press closer to Elena until it had gone by. Each time they stopped to rest the horses, Danny practiced his new vocabulary, his confidence growing with every successfully formed sign. They reached Billings as the sun was setting, the town larger and busier than Deerhorn Crossing, buildings pressed close together and smoke rising from 100 chimneys. Colt navigated to the address Danny provided, a modest house on the edge of town where Danny's uncle supposedly lived. The man who answered the door was Danny's uncle in appearance, same sharp features, same wiry build. but his expression when he saw Danny was far from welcoming. "What's he doing here?" he asked, not directing the question at Danny, but at the adults around him. His mother was supposed to keep him another month. "I'm not ready for a boy yet." "He was put off the stage 2 days ago," Colt said, his voice carefully neutral but his eyes hard. "He walked 15 miles in the snow before we found him. He's half deaf, and the driver didn't have the patience to deal with him properly." The uncle's face twisted with something between annoyance and resignation. "Of course he did. Boy's been nothing but trouble since his hearing went. Can't follow simple instructions, acts like he don't understand when you talk to him." "He's not trouble," Elena interrupted, her voice rough from disuse but perfectly clear. Everyone turned to stare at her. She rarely spoke aloud, preferring to sign and let Colt translate. But this required her own voice, imperfect as it was. "He's deaf, like me. He needs patience and people who'll communicate properly. If you can't give him that, he shouldn't be here." The uncle blinked, clearly taken aback by this deaf woman speaking to him directly, challenging him on his own doorstep. "Now look here." "No, you look," Colt said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This boy deserves better than adults who treat his deafness like a character flaw. If you're willing to learn how to communicate with him, to give him the support he needs, then we'll leave him in your care. But if you're just taking him out of obligation and plan to treat him like a burden, then we'll find somewhere else for him to go." The uncle's expression cycled through several emotions: anger, defensiveness, shame. Behind him a woman appeared, his wife, presumably, her face more open, more concerned. "Let them in, Robert," she said quietly. "It's freezing out there." Inside, around a warm stove, they talked. The uncle's wife, Margaret, asked questions, real questions, about Danny's hearing loss, about how to communicate with him, about what accommodations he'd need. She watched carefully as Elena demonstrated signs, practiced them with serious concentration, asked Danny directly what he needed rather than talking about him like he wasn't there. The uncle remained sullen and resistant until Colt leaned forward and said quietly, "My mother was Shoshone. I spent my whole childhood watching people treat her like she was less than human because she was different. It taught me that cruelty to the vulnerable says everything about the cruel person and nothing about their victim. Right now, you have a choice. Be the kind of man who rises to meet a child's needs, or be the kind who makes a boy feel ashamed for something he can't control. Which man do you want to be?" The words hung in the air, a challenge and an invitation. Finally, after a long silence, the uncle sighed. "I don't know how to talk to him. Every time I give him an instruction, he just stares at me. Makes me feel like he's being deliberately difficult." "He's not staring to be difficult," Elena explained, her voice still rough but determined. "He's reading your lips. He needs to see your face to understand you. If you turn away while talking, or cover your mouth, or speak too fast, he can't follow. It's not defiance. It's necessity." Margaret reached out and touched her husband's arm. "We can learn, Robert, for Danny. For your sister's boy. We can try." And slowly, grudgingly, the uncle nodded. They spent the next hour teaching him and Margaret basic signs, showing them how to get Danny's attention before speaking, demonstrating how to face him and speak clearly without shouting. The uncle was clumsy and frustrated at first, but he kept trying, and when Danny successfully understood a complex instruction delivered through a combination of signs and careful speech, the man's face showed something like wonder. When it was time to leave, Danny hugged Elena fiercely, signed "Thank you" with tears streaming down his face. Elena knelt to his level, signed carefully. "You're going to be fine. Keep practicing your signs. Be patient with your uncle. He's learning too. And remember, you're not broken. You're just different. That's not a weakness." On the wagon ride home, through darkness illuminated by stars and snow-reflected moonlight, Elena leaned against Colt's shoulder and signed with one hand. "We should do more of that." "More of what?" Colt signed back, managing the reins with practiced ease. "Help people like Danny, like me. There must be other deaf children out here, struggling because no one knows how to communicate with them. Other families who need teaching." Colt was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he signed, "Like a school or teaching service?" "Maybe," Elena signed. "I don't know exactly, but something, a way to connect people, teach signs, give deaf children what I never had. A community. people who understand. I think that's a wonderful idea, Colt signed. We could start small, offer lessons at the ranch, put word out that we're willing to teach families who have deaf members. See if there's interest. The idea took root and grew over the following weeks. Colt placed advertisements in newspapers across the territory. Sign language instruction available for families with deaf members or anyone interested in learning. Contact Brenner Ranch, Deerhorn Crossing. He posted notices in Silver Bend, Billings, even sent word to Boulder where the deaf school was located. The responses trickled in slowly at first. A letter from a mother whose daughter had been born deaf, asking if Elena could teach them to communicate. A note from a rancher who'd lost his hearing in an accident and was struggling to maintain his business. A query from the teacher at the Boulder Deaf School, interested in Elena's methods and experience. By late November, they had their first students, the mother and daughter, traveling from 30 miles away to spend a week at the ranch learning signs. Elena taught them in the parlor while snow fell outside, her hands moving through the language she'd almost given up hope of ever sharing. The little girl, Sarah, named coincidentally after their housekeeper, was 5 years old and had never had formal language instruction. Watching her learn to sign, seeing her face light up as she realized she could finally express complex thoughts, made Elena cry with joy. The mother cried too, signing through tears. I thought she'd never be able to tell me she loved me. I thought I'd never really know her. You've given me my daughter back. Word spread. By December, they had more requests than they could accommodate immediately. Elena started developing a curriculum, writing down signs with accompanying descriptions, creating materials that families could take home and practice. Colt built a small addition onto the house, a room specifically for teaching, with good light and a large table and a chalkboard for demonstrations. But not everyone was pleased with this development. Thomas Grady, still nursing his wounded pride months after the failed wedding, began spreading rumors in town. Elena couldn't hear them, but she saw their effects, in the way some people crossed the street to avoid her, in the hostile glances thrown her direction, in the whispers that stopped when she entered Murphy's store. It was Dorothy Morrison who finally told them what was being said, arriving at the ranch one cold afternoon with her face set in grim lines. Thomas is telling anyone who will listen that Elena's running some kind of cult out here. Says she's teaching children to reject normal speech, that she's damaging them by encouraging signs instead of proper communication. He's got a few people worked up, mostly folks who don't know better, who think deafness is something that can be fixed with enough discipline. Let him talk, Colt signed and spoke. Words are just air. We know what we're doing is right. It's more than talk, Dorothy replied. He's petitioning the Territorial Council, wants them to investigate, maybe shut down your teaching operation, claims it's endangering children. Elena felt cold dread settling in her stomach. They could lose everything they'd started building, this fragile community, this support system for people who had none. But before she could spiral into fear, Colt took her hand and signed firmly. Then we fight. We show them what we're really doing, make them see the truth. The Territorial Council hearing was set for mid-January, to be held in Silver Bend. Colt and Elena spent weeks preparing, gathering testimonials from families they'd helped, documenting their curriculum, reaching out to the Boulder School for supporting statements. The teacher there, a man named Robert Wilson, who'd been deaf since childhood, wrote a passionate letter about the importance of sign language for deaf education, about how children denied access to visual language often remained functionally illiterate their entire lives. The night before the hearing, Elena couldn't sleep. She stood at her bedroom window watching snow fall in the moonlight, her mind racing with everything that could go wrong. Colt came to stand behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, rested his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back into his warmth, his solidity. We might lose, she signed, with hands he couldn't see, but he felt the movement and stepped back so she could turn to face him. We might, he signed back honestly, but we'll have tried, and even if they shut us down here, we'll find another way. This matters too much to give up on. The hearing room in Silver Bend was packed, Thomas and his supporters on one side, Colt and Elena's allies on the other, and the 5-member Territorial Council seated at a long table in front. Thomas spoke first, his arguments predictable. Sign language was primitive, unnatural. It would prevent deaf people from integrating into normal society. Elena was taking advantage of vulnerable families, teaching their children to be content with disability rather than overcoming it. When it was their turn, Colt stood and spoke with Elena sitting beside him, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though her heart was racing. "Gentlemen, you've heard Mr. Grady's concerns. Now I'd like you to hear from some of the families we've actually worked with." One by one, they came forward. Danny's Uncle Robert, who admitted he'd initially been resistant, but had learned that communicating with his nephew in sign language had transformed their relationship. The mother of 5-year-old Sarah, who demonstrated how her daughter could now tell her what she wanted, what she felt, what she dreamed about, things that had been impossible before Elena's teaching. Frank Morrison, respected in the community, who testified that the Brenners were doing important work that harmed no one and helped many. Then Elena stood. The room fell silent. Many had never heard her speak aloud, and the novelty of it commanded attention. Her voice was imperfect, the tones not quite right because she'd never heard them properly, but the words were clear enough. "I am deaf. I have been deaf my whole life. When I was young, people told my mother not to teach me signs, said I should focus on speech, on being as normal as possible, but I was never going to be hearing. No amount of speech training would change that. What sign language gave me was access to the world, the ability to learn, to communicate, to express complex thoughts. Without it, I would have remained isolated, cut off from education and community. The children I teach deserve that same access. We're not preventing them from learning speech. We're giving them language, period. And language is a human right." She sat down to absolute silence. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Others joined. Not everyone, but enough. The council members conferred quietly among themselves for several minutes while the room held its collective breath. Finally, the head councilman spoke. "Mrs. Brenner, Mr. Brenner, the council sees no reason to restrict your educational activities. You're providing a service to families who request it, you're not forcing anyone to participate, and the testimonials speak to the value of your work. Mr. Grady's petition is denied." The relief was so intense, Elena felt dizzy. Colt's hand found hers under the table, squeezed tight. They'd won, not just the hearing, but the right to continue building what they'd started. Thomas left immediately, his face dark with rage. But as Elena and Colt gathered their materials to go, several people approached. People who'd been in the audience, who'd heard the testimonials, who had questions about learning signs for their own deaf family members. By the time they left Silver Bend, they had 6 new families waiting for instruction. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and revealing land hungry for growth. With it came more students, not just families with deaf children, but curious neighbors, local teachers wanting to better serve potential deaf students. Even a few deaf adults who'd never had access to formal sign language instruction and were hungry to learn. Elena found herself teaching almost daily, her curriculum expanding and evolving with each new student. Colt learned alongside everyone else, his signing now fluent enough that he could translate complex conversations with ease. Sarah took to teaching some of the basic classes herself, her natural warmth and patience making her an excellent instructor for beginners. By summer, what had started as informal lessons had grown into something that looked suspiciously like a real school. They'd converted the barn's upper level into a classroom, installed proper desks and learning materials, even created a small library of books about deaf history and culture that Elena ordered from back east. The unofficial name everyone started using was the Brenner School, though Elena privately thought of it as something else, a sanctuary. A place where being deaf wasn't a deficit to overcome, but simply a fact to accommodate, where difference was understood rather than punished. In July, a letter arrived from the Territorial Education Board. Colt read it aloud to Elena, translating as he went. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Brenner, it has come to our attention that you are operating an educational facility for deaf students. We would like to offer official recognition and modest funding to support your efforts, contingent upon periodic inspections to ensure educational standards are being met." Elena stared at him, hardly believing it. Official recognition meant legitimacy, protection, the ability to grow without fear of being shut down by hostile forces. It meant what they'd built was real, was valued, was making a difference beyond just their small corner of Montana territory. That evening, they rode up to the meadow cabin, their place, where Colt had first told her he loved her. They sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in impossible colors, And Colt signed with the easy fluency of someone who'd made her language his own. "We did it. We actually did it." "You did it," Elena signed back. "You gave me the space and support to do what I'd always wanted but never thought possible." "We did it together," Colt corrected. "That's what partnership means. Your dreams became our dreams. Your mission became our mission." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began emerging overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their unlikely beginning 9 months earlier. Elena thought about the girl who'd walked into that church expecting humiliation and obligation, who'd been rescued not by a man but by the possibility of a different kind of life. That girl seemed like someone from another lifetime. So much had changed, so much had been built on the foundation of that terrible, wonderful day. By autumn, the school had 20 regular students and twice as many families who'd completed their training and gone home to practice. Elena had trained 3 additional teachers, 2 deaf adults who'd traveled from out of territory specifically to learn her methods, and Dorothy Morrison, whose natural warmth and dedication made her a favorite among young students. The town of Deerhorn Crossing, which had once mocked Elena's silence, now saw sign language on its streets regularly. Shopkeepers who'd learned basic signs to serve deaf customers, children practicing finger spelling they'd learned from deaf classmates, casual conversations happening in visual language alongside spoken ones. The change wasn't total. There were still people who disapproved, who thought the whole thing was unnatural or wrong, but they were increasingly the minority. Thomas Grady eventually left town, unable to tolerate the constant reminder of his humiliation. Elena felt no triumph at his departure, only relief that his cruelty would no longer cast shadows over vulnerable people. Some battles weren't worth winning, they were just worth ending. On their first anniversary, Colt proposed again, this time not out of rescue or impulse, but out of love tested and proven. They held a ceremony in the meadow, with Dorothy and Frank Morrison as witnesses, Sarah as officiant, and a handful of students and their families in attendance. No church, no judgmental crowds, no performance for people whose opinions didn't matter. Just vows exchanged in sign language, promises made with full knowledge of what they meant, love declared in the language Elena had almost given up hope of anyone else learning. "I promise to keep learning your language," Colt signed, his hands steady and sure. "Not just signs, but all the ways you communicate, your expressions, your silence, your truth. I promise to stand with you, not in front of you, to support your dreams without trying to control them, to love you exactly as you are, not as anyone thinks you should be." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she signed her own vows. "I promise to trust you with my fears as well as my joys, to be honest even when honesty is difficult, to build our life together as partners, never as owner and owned, to love you for seeing me when everyone else looked through me, to keep choosing you every day for as long as we both live." They sealed their vows with a kiss while their community applauded, some clapping, others using the sign for applause, and hands raised and shaking in the air. It was perfect in its imperfection, beautiful in its strangeness, exactly what both of them had needed without knowing they needed it. Years passed, and the school grew. By the time Montana achieved statehood in 1889, the Brenner School for the Deaf was officially recognized across the region, attracting students from surrounding states and territories. Elena published a textbook on sign language instruction that was adopted by schools across the West. Colt expanded the ranch to help fund the school's operations, their partnership extending to every aspect of their lives. They never had children of their own, not out of inability but out of choice, deciding that the hundreds of students who passed through their school were family enough. Elena became a mother figure to generations of deaf children who finally had someone who understood them, who could teach them that their silence was powerful rather than empty. When Dorothy Morrison died in 1895, the community came together to honor her memory. Elena stood at her grave and signed a eulogy that Colt translated for the hearing attendees. She was born into one world and chose to bridge to another. She learned our language not because she had to, but because she believed we deserved to be heard. That kind of love that requires effort, that crosses boundaries, that refuses to accept separation as inevitable, that's the love that changes the world. In 1902, the territorial government officially renamed their institution, the Elena Wells Brenner School for the Deaf. Elena protested. It felt too much like monument building, but Colt was firm. You've given hundreds of people their voices back. Let them honor that. Let them honor you. The school's motto, carved above the main door, was suggested by a former student and approved by unanimous vote. Here, silence speaks louder. Colt lived to be 73, dying peacefully in 1921 with Elena holding his hand, signing "I love you" over and over until his eyes closed for the last time. In his will, he left everything to the school, ensuring it would continue long after both of them were gone. Elena lived another decade without him, throwing herself into the school's work with renewed dedication. She trained the next generation of teachers, established scholarship funds for deaf students who couldn't afford tuition, and wrote prolifically about deaf education and rights. Her final publication, completed just months before her death in 1931, was titled The Language of Hands, A Life in Signs, an autobiography that became required reading in deaf education programs across the country. When she died at age 74, the funeral was attended by hundreds, former students, fellow teachers, members of the deaf community from across the nation, and townspeople from Deerhorn Crossing who'd watched her transform from the girl they'd mocked into the woman they'd learned to respect. The service was conducted entirely in sign language, with spoken translation for hearing attendees, a reversal that would have seemed impossible in the church where Elena's journey had begun 52 years earlier. They buried her next to Colt in the meadow they'd loved, under trees whose roots held 50 years of their footsteps. The headstone was simple, carved with words in English and fingerspelling. Elena Wells Brenner, 1857–1931. She taught the world to listen. But her real monument wasn't stone. It was the school that continued to thrive, the teachers she'd trained who went on to establish programs across the country, the thousands of deaf people who'd learned from her that their way of communicating wasn't broken, but simply different, that silence could be as eloquent as sound, that being understood was a right rather than a privilege. The Elena Wells Brenner School operated continuously for 87 years before merging with a larger deaf education institution in 1976. But by then, sign language had gained recognition across America, deaf culture was acknowledged and celebrated, and the work Elena had started in that Montana ranch house had rippled out to touch millions of lives. Students who visited the historical site in later years would stand in the restored classroom and learn the story. How a woman arrived at a church expecting humiliation and found rescue instead, how a stranger's kindness had sparked a revolution in understanding, how partnership built on respect could transform not just two lives but an entire community's conception of what it meant to be different. The old church in Deerhorn Crossing, where it had all begun, was eventually converted into a museum. Visitors could see the aisle Elena had walked as a bride twice in one day, could read accounts of that scandalous wedding, could trace the path from public mockery to public triumph. The museum's final exhibit was a photograph from 1920, Elena and Colt standing in front of their school, surrounded by students of all ages, everyone's hands frozen mid-sign in whatever they'd been communicating when the shutter clicked. Elena's expression in that photograph was one of deep contentment, not the wild joy of youth, but the settled satisfaction of someone who'd found their purpose and pursued it fully. Beside her, Colt's hand rested on her shoulder, and even in the still image, the love between them was evident, built not on grand gestures, but on 50 years of daily kindness, mutual respect, and the revolutionary act of truly seeing another person. The tour guides would tell visitors that the most remarkable thing about Elena and Colt's story wasn't the dramatic rescue or the successful school or even the social change they'd inspired. It was the simplicity of their core belief that every person deserved dignity. That difference wasn't deficit, that love meant learning someone's language rather than demanding they speak yours. In a world that often measured worth by conformity, they'd built a sanctuary for the different, the misunderstood, the people whose silence had been mistaken for emptiness. And in doing so, they'd proven that the most powerful revolutions often begin with one person refusing to accept cruelty as inevitable, one stranger choosing kindness over convenience, one voice, silent or spoken, insisting that everyone deserves to be heard. The story of Elena and Colt became legend in Montana. passed down through generations with the embellishments and alterations that legends acquire. But the core remained true, that on a June day in 1879, in a church full of mockery, a rancher had looked at a deaf woman and seen not a burden but a person worth defending. And that choice, that split-second decision to intervene when it would have been easier to walk away, had changed everything. For Elena, for Colt, for the hundreds of students who found their voices in a language of hands, for a town that learned the difference between hearing and listening, for a culture that slowly began to understand that silence could speak volumes if anyone bothered to learn its language. And though the school eventually closed and the buildings fell to ruin, and new generations forgot the names that had once been spoken with reverence, the impact remained, woven into the fabric of how America treated its deaf citizens, embedded in education policies and cultural attitudes, present in every sign language interpreter and inclusive classroom and accommodation made for people who experience the world differently. Because that's what real change looks like. Not one dramatic moment, but thousands of small decisions made over decades by people who believed that dignity wasn't negotiable, that understanding required effort, that everyone deserved to be seen for who they truly were rather than what others assumed them to be. And it all started with a stranger who caught a falling woman and decided she was worth catching, again and again and again, for the rest of their lives together.